A 12-year-old boy sits outside the gate of a biker clubhouse in the freezing desert night. He doesn't cry. He doesn't beg. He just waits, for 2 days straight, until one of the most dangerous men in Devil's Ridge finally walks out to ask him what he wants. And the answer? The answer nearly drops a 240-pound combat veteran to his knees. Because that boy carries a name the Brotherhood buried 3 years ago. A name that still echoes through every engine they've ever rebuilt. What happens next will test everything these men believe about loyalty, protection, and the meaning of family. Stay with me until the very end of this one, folks. Hit that like button, drop a comment, tell me what city you're watching from, and let's ride. The temperature in the high desert dropped 30 degrees after sundown, and nobody inside the Devil's Ridge Brotherhood Clubhouse noticed or cared. The building sat at the edge of a 2-lane highway 17 miles east of Barstow. A concrete rectangle with a corrugated steel roof that had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt made of rust. 3 Harleys and a beat-up Softail lined the front. A neon Budweiser sign buzzed in the window, throwing red light across the gravel lot and stuttering pulses. Inside, somebody had the jukebox cranked to Waylon Jennings and the pool table running, and the sound of it, cue balls cracking, boots on concrete, men laughing the way men laugh when they've survived things nobody asks about, leaked through the walls and carried out into the cold. Manny Hooks Delgado stood at the bar, nursing his 3rd black coffee of the night. He was 53 years old, built like a refrigerator somebody had dragged through a war zone and forgotten to clean. His left hand was missing 2 fingers, index and middle, taken by an IED outside Fallujah in 2004, and the remaining 3 had a permanent curl to them, like they were always halfway to making a fist. His beard was gray-streaked and unkempt. His eyes were the color of motor oil in bad light, and they never settled on anything for long. He'd been VP of the Devil's Ridge chapter for 11 years, which meant he handled the things the president didn't want to touch and carried the weight of decisions that kept other men awake at night. He didn't sleep much himself. Hadn't for 20 years. The VA had given him pills once. He'd flushed them after a week and started drinking coffee instead, 4 or 5 pots a day until his hands trembled and his heart did things hearts probably shouldn't do at his age. It was a bad solution to a worse problem, but it was his, and he owned it the way he owned everything else, silently, without complaint, with the grim understanding that nobody was coming to fix it. "You see that kid out there?" The voice belonged to Reaper, a wiry prospect with a neck tattoo and a nervous habit of cracking his knuckles in rapid-fire sequences. He'd wandered in from a smoke break, cold air still clinging to his jacket. Manny didn't look up from his coffee. "What kid?" "Outside the fence, sitting on the ground by the gate. He was there when I went out. He's still there. He'll leave. He looks young, man, like real young. Then he'll leave faster." Reaper stood there for a moment, opening and closing his mouth like he wanted to say something else but couldn't find the architecture for it. Then he shrugged and walked toward the pool table, and Manny went back to his coffee, and the jukebox switched to Merle Haggard, and the night continued the way nights always continued at Devil's Ridge. Loud inside, dead outside, the desert holding its breath around them like it was waiting for something none of them could name. 2 hours later, Manny stepped outside to check the bikes. Force of habit. He'd done it every night for over a decade, running his remaining fingers along the chrome, checking tire pressure by feel, making sure nobody had tampered with anything while they were inside pretending the world couldn't reach them here. The cold hit him immediately. Dry, sharp, the kind that crawled under your skin and settled into your joints. He pulled his collar up and walked the line of motorcycles, breath coming out in white plumes that dissolved against the dark. He almost didn't look toward the gate, but something pulled his eyes that direction. Not sound, not movement, just a shape that didn't belong. A small shape. Huddled against the chain-link fence post on the outside, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around a backpack that looked like it had been dragged through 3 states' worth of dirt. A kid. Reaper hadn't been wrong about the age. 12, maybe. 13 at the outside. Thin in a way that suggested not just hunger but the kind of sustained neglect that shrinks a body from the inside out. Dark hair, matted and dusty. A hoodie that was at least 2 sizes too big. The cuffs pulled down over his hands. No jacket, no sleeping bag. Nothing but the backpack and whatever was left of the warmth inside him, which couldn't have been much. Manny stood there for a long moment, 30 feet away, studying the kid the way he used to study terrain in Anbar province, looking for threats, for tells, for the thing that didn't fit. The boy wasn't sleeping. His eyes were open, reflecting the red neon from the window in two small points. He was watching the clubhouse with an expression that Manny couldn't read from this distance, but that didn't look like fear. It looked like patience. That bothered Manny more than fear would have. He turned around and went back inside. The next morning, the kid was still there. Manny saw him through the window while he was making coffee at 6 a.m. The only one awake in a clubhouse that smelled like stale beer and engine grease and the particular funk of men who lived too close together and didn't care. The boy had shifted positions, now sitting cross-legged, backpack in his lap, but he hadn't moved from the gate. The desert morning light made him look even smaller, even thinner, a smudge of humanity against the chain link and the vast nothing beyond it. "Still out there?" Manny muttered to nobody. By noon, 3 other brothers had noticed. Big Phil, who ran the garage, had offered his professional opinion that the kid was probably a runaway and they should call the county. Deacon, who handled club security and had trust issues that made Manny's look mild, suggested the kid might be bait. Some kind of setup, a law enforcement play, somebody trying to get them to do something stupid that could be used against them later. "He's 12, Manny said. "I've seen 12-year-olds wired with explosives," Deacon replied, and the room went quiet because Deacon had done 3 tours and said things like that sometimes, and nobody knew how to respond. Ruben President Montoya, who led the chapter with the calm authority of a man who'd learned to carry power without swinging it, listened to all of this from his usual seat in the corner and said nothing. He was 61, his ponytail gone silver, his leather cut so faded the patches looked like they'd been applied in another century. He had a way of being still that wasn't passive. It was the stillness of someone calculating angles, measuring distances, waiting for the right moment to speak. When he finally did, it was always worth hearing. But today, he didn't speak. He just drank his coffee and watched the window and let the silence do whatever the silence was going to do. The second night was colder than the first. Manny knew because he stood outside at 11 p.m. smoking a cigarette. He told himself he'd quit 6 months ago, and the cold came at him like something personal, like the desert had decided to test him specifically. He could see the kid at the gate, still there, still awake. The boy had wrapped his arms around himself and was rocking slightly, not dramatically, not the way people rock in movies, but the small, instinctive motion of a body trying to generate heat when there's nothing left to burn. Manny smoked his cigarette down to the filter. He crushed it under his boot. He went inside, poured a cup of coffee, came back out, walked to the gate, and set the cup down on the ground on the kid's side of the fence without saying a word. Then he turned and walked back. When he checked an hour later, the cup was empty. Dawn cracked open the sky like something breaking. Pink and gold over the ridgeline, the kind of beauty that felt wasted on a landscape this harsh. Manny was outside before anyone else, which was normal. What wasn't normal was that he walked directly to the gate this time, and the kid watched him come with those steady, 2 old eyes, and neither of them said anything for a full 10 seconds. Manny looked at the boy. Dust on his face, cracked lips, hands raw from the cold. But the eyes were clear and focused and had a kind of ferocity in them that Manny recognized from places he didn't like to think about. The look of someone who had decided something and wasn't going to be talked out of it. "You've been here 2 nights, Manny said. "Yes, sir." "Why?" The boy took a breath. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rehearsed. It was the breath of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was about to set it down in front of a stranger and hope the stranger didn't kick it away. "My grandpa said you protect good people." Manny's chest did something he didn't expect. A tightening, a recognition, the kind of feeling he'd spent 2 decades learning to suppress because feelings got people killed and he'd seen enough killing to last several lifetimes. "Your grandpa," he said carefully. "Harold Barnes." The name hit the morning air like a gunshot. Manny didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe for a count of 3. He just stood there on his side of the chain-link fence, looking down at this 12-year-old boy who had just detonated a ghost into the middle of everything. Harold Barnes. The name hadn't been spoken out loud in this compound in 3 years, not because it was forbidden, because it hurt too much. Harold had been a founding member. Harold had been the one who'd written half the bylaws, who'd held the club together during the split of 2009, who'd driven 400 miles in a blizzard to sit with Reuben's wife while she was dying because Reuben was locked up and couldn't be there. Harold had been the conscience of the Devil's Ridge Brotherhood, the man who reminded them, quietly and consistently, that they were protectors first and everything else second. Harold had died of a heart attack in his garage on a Tuesday afternoon, alone. Working on a 72 shovelhead he'd been restoring for a decade. They'd found him on the floor with a wrench in his hand and grease under his fingernails, and something about that, the specificity of it, the ordinary brutality of a good man dying alone in the middle of something he loved, had cracked the club open in ways that hadn't fully healed. And now Harold's grandson was sitting at their gate. "Wait here," Manny said, which was pointless because the kid had already proven he could wait longer than most adults could function. He walked back inside. Straight to Reuben's room, knocked once, hard. "It's 6 a.m, Reuben said through the door. Harold Barnes had a grandson. Silence. Then the sound of feet on the floor, a belt being buckled, the door opening. Reuben stood there in a wrinkled t-shirt, his silver hair loose around his shoulders, and his eyes, which had seen everything and feared nothing, held something Manny hadn't seen in them in years. Pain. "Where?" Reuben said. "At the gate. Been there 2 days." They walked out together, side by side, the way they'd done everything for 30 years. Through the clubhouse where the early risers were starting to stir, out the front door, across the gravel lot, their boots crunching in unison. The morning light was harder now, the gold burned off, replaced by the flat white glare of a desert sun that offered illumination without warmth. The boy stood up when he saw them coming. He didn't step back, he didn't look away. He held his ground the way Harold used to hold his ground, not with aggression, but with a quiet certainty that said, "I'm here and I have a right to be here, and I'm not leaving until someone gives me a reason to." Reuben opened the gate. Not a word. Just reached down, unlatched the chain, and pulled it open. The metal groaned, rusty and loud in the morning quiet. "Come inside," Reuben said. The boy picked up his backpack, slowly, like it was heavier than it should have been, which maybe it was, and walked through the gate. He didn't look back at the spot where he'd spent 2 nights. He didn't hesitate. He walked like someone who'd been walking for a long time and had finally been told he could stop. Inside the clubhouse, the world shifted. Big Phil dropped a coffee mug. Deacon stood up from his chair with his hand instinctively moving toward his hip before he caught himself. The 3 other brothers at the bar turned and stared with the collective disbelief of men watching something they weren't prepared for. A 12-year-old boy stood in the middle of the Devil's Ridge Brotherhood clubhouse, holding a dirty backpack, blinking in the fluorescent light, surrounded by men with scars and tattoos, and the accumulated damage of lifetimes spent on the wrong side of everything society considered acceptable. And he looked more comfortable than any of them. "Sit down," Reuben said, pointing to a chair at the bar. The boy sat. "When's the last time you ate?" The boy thought about it, actually thought about it, the way someone does when the answer isn't immediate, because the concept of regular meals has become theoretical rather than practical. "Day before yesterday, I think. There was a gas station." Manny was already moving toward the kitchen. He didn't ask what the kid wanted, he made what was available. Eggs scrambled in too much butter, toast burnt on one side because the toaster had been broken since 2019, black coffee that he diluted with enough milk to make it drinkable for someone who probably shouldn't be drinking coffee at all. He set it down in front of the boy and stepped back. Charlie Barnes ate like a machine, methodical, efficient, no wasted motion. He didn't shovel food in. He consumed it with the disciplined urgency of someone who'd learned that meals were opportunities, not guarantees. When he finished, he set the fork down precisely parallel to the plate and looked up. "Thank you." 2 words, quiet, genuine, and somehow devastating. Reuben pulled a chair around and sat facing him. The room had gone silent. Even the jukebox had gone quiet, the last song ending without anyone feeding it another quarter. "Charlie," Reuben said. "That your name?" "Yes, sir. Charlie Barnes." "Harold was your grandfather." "Yes, sir." "Tell me where your mother is." Something shifted in Charlie's face. Not a flinch, more like a door closing, a shutter dropping behind his eyes that was too practiced for a 12-year-old, which meant he'd had reason to practice it. "I don't know," he said. "She left after Grandpa died. Her boyfriend, Dale, he let me stay for a while. Then he didn't." The room absorbed this. 7 men, each carrying their own catalog of damage, heard the gaps in what the boy wasn't saying and filled them with things that made their hands tighten and their jaws clench. "He didn't," Manny repeated, keeping his voice flat, neutral, the voice he used when he needed to not react. "What does that mean, Charlie?" "It means he threw my stuff on the lawn and told me if I came back he'd call the cops, or worse." "When was this?" 5 days ago." 5 days. The math crawled through Manny's skull. 5 days meant the kid had traveled, walked, hitched, somehow covered, the distance from wherever Harold had lived to this compound in the middle of the desert. Alone. Without money. Without food. Without anyone in the world to call. "How'd you get here?" Big Phil asked, and his voice had changed. Lost its usual gruffness. Gone soft in a way that looked uncomfortable on a man his size. "Walked, mostly. A trucker gave me a ride from Victorville. I told him I was visiting my uncle." "You know the way here?" "Grandpa brought me once, when I was 8. He showed me the gate and said, 'If anything ever happens, you come here. These men will take care of you.'" Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, and somewhere outside a crow called, and the refrigerator hummed its constant drone, and inside the silence was the sound of 7 men realizing that a dead brother had made them a promise they didn't know about, and a 12-year-old boy had walked through the desert to collect on it. Reuben stood up. He crossed to the window, looked out at the gravel lot, at the gate the boy had waited outside for 2 nights, at the endless stretch of scrubland beyond it. When he turned back, his face was set. Decision made. "Phil, make up the back room. Clean sheets. Rube, clean sheets, extra blankets. It gets cold back there." "We can't just," Deacon started. "Harold Barnes rode with this club for 22 years, Reuben said, and his voice had the weight of something that was not going to be moved. "He put his body between this club and trouble more times than any of us can count. He never asked for anything. Not once. Not one single thing. And the one thing he did, the one thing he ever set up, was to tell his grandson that if the world fell apart, he could come here." He paused, looked at Deacon, looked at each of them in turn. "The world fell apart. The boy came here. That's the end of the conversation." Deacon held Reuben's gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and sat back down. It wasn't agreement exactly. It was something closer to acknowledgement, the recognition that some debts don't have expiration dates, and some promises survive the men who made them. Big Phil disappeared down the hallway. Manny heard him banging around in the storage closet, pulling out blankets that smelled like mothballs and dust. Charlie sat at the bar with his empty plate and his dirty backpack and his steady eyes, watching everything, absorbing everything, filing it away with the survival instincts of someone who'd learned early that understanding your environment was the difference between safety and destruction. Over the next hours, the clubhouse rearranged itself around the boy's presence. Not dramatically. There were no speeches, no group hugs, no cinematic declarations of protection. It was smaller than that. Quieter. Someone turned the jukebox down. Someone swept the broken glass from last week's argument off the back hallway floor. Deacon moved his gun case from the common area to his room without being asked. Big Phil found a towel that wasn't stained with oil and left it on the bed in the back room. These were not men who knew how to take care of a child. They were men who knew how to survive, how to fix machines, how to stand between danger and the people behind them. The language of caregiving was foreign to them, spoken with an accent so thick it was barely recognizable. But they spoke it anyway, in the only dialect they knew, actions performed without commentary, protection offered without conditions, space made without ceremony. Charlie didn't cry, not when Big Phil showed him the room. Not when Manny brought him a second plate of food. Not when Reaper found an old sweatshirt that was only slightly too big and left it folded on the pillow. The boy accepted everything with the same quiet gravity. Thank you, and nothing more, repeated like a code he'd memorized because it was the only currency he had left. But that night, after the lights went out and the clubhouse settled into its nocturnal rhythm of snoring and creaking and the distant sound of coyotes in the hills, Manny walked past the back room and heard something that stopped him in the hallway. Not crying, not quite. Something smaller and harder than crying. The sound of a child breathing in hitches, trying to be silent, pressing his face into a pillow that smelled like strangers, shaking with the effort of holding himself together in a world that had systematically given him nothing to hold on to. Manny stood in that hallway for 11 minutes. He counted. He didn't go in, didn't knock. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, 3 inches of drywall between him and the sound, his 3 remaining fingers pressed against the wall, remembering another sound from another time. A soldier in a field hospital making the same noise, the same desperate attempt at silence, the same belief that being heard was the same as being weak. When the breathing finally evened out, Manny walked back to the bar, poured himself a coffee, and sat in the dark. He sat there until morning, and the question that turned over and over in his mind, the question none of them had said out loud yet, the one they were all circling like wolves around a fire, settled into the silence and refused to leave. What happens when the system finds out a motorcycle club is housing a 12-year-old boy with no legal guardian, no documentation, and a mother who could walk through that gate at any moment and tear everything apart? The system came for Charlie Barnes on a Tuesday, not with sirens, not with warrants, with something worse, a woman in a gray pantsuit carrying a clipboard and a smile that had been practiced so many times it had lost whatever warmth it might have originally contained. She drove a white county sedan with a cracked windshield and parked it 20 feet from the gate like she'd done this before. Like she'd pulled up to places that didn't want her and delivered news that nobody wanted to hear and driven away before the damage fully registered. Manny saw her from the garage bay where he was showing Charlie how to gap spark plugs. The boy had been with them 9 days now, and in those 9 days something had shifted in the compound. Not dramatically, not in any way you could point to and name, but the way a house shifts when you add a room. The architecture changes. The weight distributes differently. Walls that used to bear one kind of load suddenly bear another. "Stay here," Manny said. Charlie looked up from the spark plug, his fingers smudged with carbon. He followed Manny's eyes to the white sedan and the woman stepping out of it, and his face did the thing it did. The shutter dropping, the door closing, the 12-year-old disappearing behind the survival mechanism that no 12-year-old should have needed to build. "I know what that is," Charlie said. "Stay here." Manny walked out of the garage, wiping his hands on a rag that was dirtier than his hands. Reuben was already crossing the lot from the clubhouse, moving with the deliberate pace of a man who understood that speed conveyed anxiety and anxiety conveyed weakness. Big Phil appeared in the clubhouse doorway but stayed there, leaning against the frame, arms crossed over his massive chest. The woman had stopped at the gate. She held up an ID badge with the practiced motion of someone who expected it to function as both introduction and authority. "Sandra Whitfield, San Bernardino County Child Protective Services. I'm looking for a minor named Charles David Barnes." Reuben reached the gate. He didn't open it. "What's this about?" "We received a report that a minor may be residing at this location without legal guardianship. I'm here to conduct a welfare check and assess the child's living situation." "Report from who?" "I'm not at liberty to disclose that, sir. May I come in?" Reuben looked at her for a long moment. The morning sun was behind him, which meant she was squinting up at a 6'1" silhouette in a leather cut with patches she probably couldn't read, but certainly understood the general meaning of. He could have made this difficult. He could have demanded paperwork, cited property rights, sent her away with the kind of polite hostility that men in his position had perfected over decades of institutional friction. Instead, he opened the gate. "Coffee?" Sandra Whitfield blinked. Whatever she'd been prepared for, it wasn't hospitality. Yes, thank you." She walked the lot like she was cataloging it. Eyes moving, the bikes, the garage, the oil stains on the concrete, the empty beer cans in the recycling bin by the door. Manny could see her building a narrative with every glance, assembling the version of reality that would end up in her report, translating the physical environment into the language of risk assessment and child welfare protocols. Inside the clubhouse, Deacon had vanished. So had the gun cases, the ashtrays, and the bottle of Jim Beam that usually lived on the bar. The jukebox was off. The place looked almost respectable, which was suspicious in its own way, but Sandra didn't comment. She sat at the bar, accepted the coffee Reuben poured her, and opened her clipboard to a fresh form. "Where's Charlie now?" "In the garage," Manny said from the doorway. "Working on an engine." "Is he in school?" Silence. The question landed like a stone in still water. The ripples moved outward, through Reuben's expression, through Manny's posture, through the entire unspoken infrastructure of the past 9 days, during which nobody had addressed the fact that a 12-year-old boy was spending his days in a motorcycle garage instead of a classroom. "We're working on that," Reuben said. Sandra wrote something. The scratch of her pen was the loudest sound in the room. "Who is his legal guardian?" "Currently, no one. His grandfather passed. His mother is Danielle Barnes. We have a file on her." Sandra said it without looking up, which meant the file was thick enough that she didn't need to reference it for the basics. Last known address in Victorville. Multiple reports of substance abuse, domestic disturbance, child endangerment investigations that were never concluded due to non-cooperation. "Then you know the situation," Manny said. "I know the mother's situation. What I need to understand is this one." She looked up. Her eyes were sharp, professional, and not unkind. But they belonged to a system, and systems had rules, and rules didn't care about the promises dead men made to their grandsons. "Gentlemen, I want to be straightforward with you. A child without legal guardianship living in an unregistered dwelling with adults who have no familial or legal relationship to him is a situation I'm required to address, regardless of intent." "Regardless of intent," Manny repeated. "I understand this isn't what you want to hear. What I want to hear has nothing to do with it. What's best for that kid does." "That's exactly what I'm here to determine." She asked to see the back room. Reuben took her. Manny stayed at the bar, his 3-fingered hand wrapped around a coffee cup, his jaw working on nothing, the muscles in his neck so tight they looked like cables under the skin. When they came back, Sandra's expression had shifted. Not softened, exactly, but recalibrated. The room was clean. The bed was made. There were books on the nightstand, an old Chilton manual that Big Phil had dug out of storage, a dog-eared copy of Hatchet that Reaper had found somewhere, a spiral notebook with Charlie's handwriting in it, small and careful and precise. "I'd like to speak with Charlie," Sandra said. "Alone." The word landed wrong. Every man in the room heard it and felt the same involuntary contraction. The instinct to position themselves between the boy and something that might hurt him, even if that something was a woman with a clipboard whose entire job was supposed to be preventing hurt. "He's been through enough," Manny said. "I understand that. But I need to hear from him directly. It's protocol." Reuben nodded. "Manny, get him." Manny walked to the garage. Charlie was still at the workbench, but he wasn't working. He was sitting on the stool with his hands flat on the surface, staring at nothing, and when Manny came in, the boy looked at him with an expression that was too old and too knowing for a face that still had baby fat along the jawline. "She's gonna take me," Charlie said. Not a question. "Nobody's taking you anywhere." That's what they always say. The sentence was quiet and factual, and contained an entire autobiography of betrayal. Manny felt it land in his chest like a fragment, the kind that stays embedded because removing it would cause more damage than leaving it in. "Come talk to her, tell her the truth. That's all you have to do." "The truth is I don't have anywhere else to go." "That's not the truth. The truth is you have somewhere. You're standing in it." Charlie looked at him, searched his face for the lie. The way he'd clearly learned to search every adult face for the lie that was always coming, the promise that was always breaking, the door that was always closing. Whatever he saw in Manny's expression, or didn't see, made him slide off the stool and follow him inside. The conversation between Sandra Whitfield and Charlie Barnes lasted 22 minutes. They sat at the far end of the bar, out of earshot but not out of sight, because Reuben had positioned himself at a distance that was technically respectful but practically non-negotiable. Manny stood by the window, watching without watching, his reflection a ghost in the glass. He couldn't hear the words, but he could read the body language. Sandra asking questions in her measured professional cadence, Charlie answering, short sentences, careful, guarded, offering the minimum required and holding everything else behind the wall he'd built. At one point, Sandra leaned forward and said something, and Charlie's hands tightened on the edge of the bar, knuckles white, fingers locked, and then relaxed. He answered. Sandra wrote. When it was over, Sandra stood and walked back to Reuben. He's articulate, resilient, clearly intelligent. She paused, chose her next words with the precision of someone who knew they were about to deliver a verdict. He's also been severely neglected, shows signs of prolonged emotional deprivation, and has no legal guardian, no school enrollment, and no documentation of his current living arrangement. So what happens? Reuben said. What happens is I file my report. The county will likely initiate proceedings to place Charlie in the foster care system while we attempt to locate his mother and assess her fitness for... No. The word came from the doorway. Not from Reuben, not from Manny, from Betty Mercer. She stood in the entrance with her purse over one arm and her reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the particular expression of a 68-year-old woman who had spent 30 years doing the books for the Devil's Ridge Brotherhood and was not under any circumstances going to stand in a doorway and listen to a county employee talk about putting Harold Barnes's grandson into the system. Betty was not a biker. She was not a member. She was the woman who had married one, buried him, and stayed anyway, because the club was the only family she had left, and because somebody had to make sure the tax filings were correct, and the utilities stayed on and the property insurance didn't lapse. She lived in a 2-bedroom house 4 miles from the compound, drove a 10-year-old Camry, volunteered at the county library on Wednesdays, and had a background so clean it squeaked. Emergency guardianship, Betty said, walking past Sandra to the bar and setting her purse down. I've already started the paperwork. Sandra turned. And you are? Betty Mercer. I'm Harold Barnes's Charlie's grandfather's oldest friend. I've known this child since the day he was born. I have a stable home, a clean record, and a lawyer who's expecting my call this afternoon. Mrs. Mercer, emergency guardianship requires... I know what it requires. My lawyer knows what it requires. Judge Harmon in Barstow knows what it requires, and he also knew Harold personally, which I suspect will be relevant to the proceedings. Sandra Whitfield looked at Betty Mercer. Betty Mercer looked back. The two women held each other's gaze in a way that communicated an entire negotiation without a single additional word. The county's obligation versus the community's claim. The system's protocol versus the individual's need. The official report versus the human reality of a boy who had walked through the desert to find the one place his grandfather told him was safe. I'll note your intention in my report, Sandra said, finally, but Charlie will need to be enrolled in school immediately. He'll need medical and dental exams, and there will be follow-up visits. Of course. If the guardianship isn't formalized within 30 days, the county will have to intervene. It'll be done in 2 weeks. Sandra nodded, closed her clipboard, looked once more around the clubhouse, at the men who had gone rigid during the exchange, at the boy sitting quietly at the bar, at the faded patches and scarred furniture and the Budweiser sign buzzing in the window, and walked out. Her sedan kicked up dust on the way out. The plume hung in the air for a long time. The silence that followed wasn't relief. It was the silence of men realizing how close they'd come to losing something they hadn't fully understood they were holding. Betty turned to Charlie. Her expression shifted, not dramatically, but the way a landscape shifts when the light changes. Harder edges softening, professional composure giving way to something older and less guarded. Do you remember me? She asked. Charlie studied her face. You made lemon cake at Grandpa's house. Betty's mouth trembled. Just once. She pressed her lips together and nodded. That's right. I did. He said you were the toughest person he ever met. Betty didn't respond to that. She picked up her purse, straightened her glasses, and looked at Reuben. I'll need you to bring his things to my house this afternoon, and someone needs to take him shopping. He needs clothes that fit. I'll handle it, Manny said. Betty looked at Manny. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. An understanding, a contract, the kind of agreement that didn't require signatures or witnesses because it was written in a language older than law. Don't let him down, she said. Then she walked out, and the clubhouse exhaled. The emergency guardianship went through in 11 days. Betty's lawyer was a former Marine who understood urgency and had no patience for bureaucratic delays. Judge Harmon signed the papers in his chambers with a photograph of Harold Barnes's memorial service still on the shelf behind his desk, because Harold had fixed the judge's motorcycle twice, free of charge. And in small desert towns, that kind of thing mattered. Charlie moved into Betty's house on a Saturday. Manny drove him in the pickup, the boy's backpack and 2 new bags of clothes from Walmart in the truck bed. The house was small, clean, quiet. A 1-story stucco with a yard that Betty maintained with the same precision she'd applied to 30 years of financial records. The spare bedroom had been painted, light blue. There were curtains. Charlie stood in the doorway and looked at the room and didn't move for a long time. "This is yours," Betty said from behind him. "For how long?" "For as long as you need it." The boy walked in, set his backpack on the bed, touched the curtains with one finger, feeling the fabric. This simple domestic detail that most children would never notice, but that Charlie touched like it was evidence of something he'd stopped believing existed. "Thank you," he said. Same 2 words, same quiet delivery. But his voice cracked on the second word, just barely, the structural integrity of his composure developing its first visible fracture. Betty nodded and left him alone. She understood, the way some people understand without being told, that the boy needed time with the reality of a room that belonged to him. Time to let it settle, to test it, to wait for it to be taken away, and then to slowly, cautiously accept that maybe it wouldn't be. The routine formed itself. Betty drove Charlie to Desert View Middle School every morning at 7:30. Manny picked him up at 3 and brought him to the compound, where he worked in the garage until 6. Spark plugs, carburetors, oil changes, the fundamental vocabulary of engines that Big Phil taught, with the patience of a man who had found the one thing he was qualified to teach. Betty picked him up at 6, took him home, fed him dinner, supervised his homework at the kitchen table while she reconciled the club's accounts on her laptop. It worked. For 5 weeks it worked. The social worker came twice. Charlie was enrolled. He had a bed, meals, medical records, a legal guardian, and an address. On paper, the situation was resolved. But paper doesn't account for what happens at 3 in the morning when a boy wakes up screaming from a dream he won't describe, drenched in sweat, clawing at the sheets like he's trying to escape something that isn't in the room. Betty called Manny the first time it happened. "He's having nightmares." "How bad?" "He wouldn't come out of the closet for an hour. He was hiding in the closet, Manny. He was 12 years old and hiding in a closet at 3 in the morning. Manny drove over. He sat on the floor outside the closet door and didn't say a word. Just sat there, breathing, present. The way he'd sat in the hallway of the clubhouse that first night, listening to the boy try not to cry. After 40 minutes, the closet door opened and Charlie was sitting in the corner with his arms around his knees, eyes red, face blank. "Dale?" Manny asked. One word. Charlie didn't answer. He didn't need to. The closet, the hiding, the 3 a.m. terror, it was all a map to something Manny could read without explanation because he'd seen the terrain before, in different faces, in different closets, in the same dark. "What did he do to you, Charlie?" "Nothing." "Charlie." "He didn't... It wasn't..." The boy's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the closet floor, fingers splayed, trying to hold himself to something solid. "He just hit things. Walls, mostly. Sometimes the table, sometimes close to me, but not... He never actually... But you didn't know if he would." Charlie looked up. And there it was. The thing beneath the composure, beneath the patience, beneath the 12-year-old's extraordinary ability to present a functional exterior to a dysfunctional world. Terror. Old, deep, foundational. The kind that wires itself into a child's nervous system and becomes part of the architecture, so that every loud noise, every raised voice, every door slamming in another room triggers the same cascade of adrenaline and cortisol and the desperate animal need to make yourself small enough that the danger can't find you. "Every night," Charlie whispered. "He'd come home and I could hear his truck, and I'd count the seconds between the truck door and the front door. If it was fast, he was angry. If it was slow, he was drunk. Angry was loud. Drunk was worse because drunk was quiet, and then suddenly not quiet." Manny sat with this, let it fill the space between them, didn't minimize it, didn't interpret it, didn't do any of the things that well-meaning adults do when confronted with a child's damage. The reassurances, the promises, the gentle lies about how everything is different now and the bad thing is over. Because Manny knew from his own architecture of damage that the bad thing is never over. It just changes address. It moves from the house to the body, from the body to the dreams, from the dreams to the moments between seconds, when the world goes sideways and you're back in the closet, back in the truck, back in the field outside Fallujah, listening to the sound that came before the sound that took your fingers. "You're safe here," Manny said. And then, because he refused to lie to this kid, that doesn't mean the feeling goes away. It means you're not alone with it. Charlie stared at him, searching again, always searching. "How do you know?" Manny held up his three-fingered hand. "Because I still count the seconds, too." They sat in the closet together for another 20 minutes. Then Charlie crawled out, got back in bed, and Manny sat in the chair by the window until the boy fell asleep. He drove back to the compound at 4:30 in the morning, and the horizon was just starting to lighten, and the cold was absolute, and his coffee was hours old, and somewhere in the back of his mind a clock was ticking that he couldn't see but could feel. The countdown to the thing he knew was coming, because things that worked never kept working, not for people like them, not in a world that had opinions about who deserved stability and who didn't. It came on a Thursday. Late afternoon, October light slanting through the garage bay at an angle that made every surface look gold and dangerous. Charlie was in the garage with Big Phil, both of them bent over a disassembled transmission, the boy's hands moving with an assurance that had been absent 6 weeks ago when Manny heard the engine. Not a Harley, not a truck. Something smaller, cheaper, running rough. A car that needed work and wasn't getting it. Driven by someone who didn't care about maintenance because maintenance required the kind of forward thinking that was incompatible with the life they were living. The rusted Nissan Sentra came up the access road trailing blue smoke. It stopped outside the gate at an angle that suggested the driver had either misjudged the distance or didn't care enough to straighten out. The door opened. Danielle Barnes stepped out. She was thin, not slender, thin in the way that broadcasts damage, the way that tells you the body has been running on chemicals instead of food, that sleep has been replaced by something that mimics wakefulness without providing rest. Her hair was bleached and dark at the roots, pulled back in a knot that was falling apart. She wore jeans that hung on her hips and a tank top that showed collarbones sharp enough to cast shadows. Her eyes moved fast, scanning the compound, the bikes, the men, with the rapid-fire assessment of someone who lived in a state of perpetual calculation, always measuring threat levels, always looking for the angle. She looked like Harold Barnes the way a photocopy looks like the original. The structure was there, the bones of it, but everything had been degraded by repetition and neglect until what remained was a faded approximation of the man who'd built this brotherhood's moral foundation. Manny stepped out of the garage. Big Phil appeared behind him. Deacon materialized from somewhere. He was good at that, appearing in exactly the spot you didn't want him to be, with exactly the expression that made you reconsider whatever you were about to do. "I want my son." Danielle's voice was raw, pitched high, vibrating with something that could have been anger or desperation, or both. The cocktail of emotions that accompanies a person who has lost control of a situation and is trying to reclaim it through volume. "Danielle," Manny said. Don't Danielle me. Where is he?" "He's not here." "Bullshit. I know he's here. I know you took him. I know. He came to us. He's 12 years old. He doesn't get to decide, where were you?" The question stopped her, not because she didn't have an answer, but because every possible answer was worse than the silence. She stood by the rusted Nissan with her fists clenched at her sides, and her jaw working and her eyes filling with something that might have been tears, or might have been the physiological response of a body in withdrawal, meeting an emotion it wasn't equipped to process. That's none of your... "You left him with Dale," Manny said. His voice was flat, controlled. The voice of a man holding a detonator steady. "You left a 12-year-old boy with a man who put holes in walls and called it parenting. And when Dale threw him out, threw a 12-year-old kid onto a lawn with a backpack, you weren't there. You weren't anywhere. I was getting clean." "Were you?" Danielle's face crumbled and reassembled in the space of a breath. The collapse was total. Mouth trembling, eyes spilling, the mask falling away to reveal the devastation underneath. And then it was gone, replaced by the hardened exterior that she'd built for exactly this purpose. The armor that allowed her to stand in front of a biker compound and demand things she had no right to demand. "He's my son. You can't keep him. I'll get a lawyer. I'll call the cops. Betty Mercer has emergency guardianship." The name hit Danielle like a physical blow. She actually took a step back. Her hand went to the car behind her for balance, fingers gripping the roof edge. And for a moment she looked like what she actually was. Not a threat, not an antagonist, not the villain in her son's story, but a 31-year-old woman standing in a parking lot in the desert trying to figure out how she'd lost everything and finding no answer that didn't circle back to herself. "Betty," she whispered, "court-ordered, legal. She hates me." "She doesn't hate you. She's protecting your son because you didn't." There was a sound from behind Manny. He turned. Charlie was standing in the garage doorway. He'd heard everything. Of course he had, because the compound wasn't big, and his mother's voice carried the way damaged things carry, loud and sharp, and impossible to ignore. Mother and son looked at each other across 40 feet of gravel. The desert wind moved between them. Dust lifted and fell. The neon Budweiser sign buzzed. A hawk circled overhead, riding a thermal, patient, and indifferent. Charlie's face was a war. Every wall he'd built, every shutter he'd installed, every mechanism of self-protection he'd assembled over 12 years of navigating a mother who appeared and disappeared like weather. All of it was straining under the weight of the thing he could not stop feeling no matter how many walls he built. He wanted her to be different. He wanted it so badly that the wanting was visible, radiating off him like heat, and it was the most dangerous thing in the compound. More dangerous than Deacon's arsenal, more dangerous than the legal precariousness of their arrangement, more dangerous than anything the county or the courts or the system could throw at them. Because hope, in a boy who had every reason to abandon it, is the thing that breaks everything. "Charlie," Danielle said. Her voice broke open on his name. "Baby, Don't." One word, 12 years old. The weight of a lifetime in 2 syllables. He turned around and walked back into the garage. They heard the sound of a wrench hitting metal. Sharp, deliberate, final. The sound of a boy choosing not to hear what his mother was about to say because he'd heard it before. Every version of it, every iteration of the apology that preceded the next disappearance. And he was done. Danielle stood in the lot. The men watched her. Nobody spoke. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing mascara across her cheekbone, and looked at Manny with an expression that was either hatred or gratitude or both at once. The impossible emotional math of a mother who has failed her child and is looking at the people who caught him when she dropped him. "This isn't over," she said. She got in the Nissan. The engine coughed to life. She drove away trailing blue smoke, and the dust plume hung in the air long after the sound disappeared, and Manny stood in the lot with the October sun on his face and the cold coming and the certain knowledge that she was right. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. Because Danielle Barnes was not going to disappear. And somewhere in that rusted Nissan, in that damaged mind, in that thin body running on desperation and whatever she'd put in it last, a decision was forming. The kind of decision that desperate people make when they've run out of options and the only thing left is the worst one. And in the garage, behind the sound of the wrench, a 12-year-old boy sat on the concrete floor with his back against a Harley-Davidson Softail and his hands pressed over his ears. And the walls he'd built were cracking, and the thing behind the walls was bigger than anything he'd ever tried to contain. And nobody, not Manny, not Betty, not the entire Devil's Ridge Brotherhood, could protect him from the one threat that no amount of loyalty could neutralize, the hope that his mother might come back and mean it this time. Danielle didn't come back for 3 weeks. That was worse than if she'd come back the next day. The next day would have meant impulse, chaos, the kind of erratic decision-making that could be managed because it burned itself out fast. 3 weeks meant planning. 3 weeks meant Danielle had gone somewhere and talked to someone and put together a strategy that was more dangerous than anything she could have assembled on her own, because Danielle Barnes operating on instinct was a storm, loud, destructive, temporary. Danielle Barnes operating on someone else's plan was something else entirely. Manny felt it coming the way he used to feel ambushes. Not through evidence, not through intelligence, but through the particular quality of silence that precedes violence. The air changes. The pattern breaks. You can't point to the thing that's wrong, but your body knows, your nervous system knows. And if you've survived enough of those moments, you stop questioning the feeling and start preparing for what follows. He didn't sleep well those 3 weeks. Not that he ever slept well, but the quality of his insomnia changed, shifted from the familiar static of old trauma to something more directional, more focused. He'd sit at the bar in the clubhouse at 2 a.m. with his coffee going cold, running scenarios the way he used to run mission briefs. And every scenario ended the same way, with the system doing what the system always did to people like them. Charlie, meanwhile, was becoming someone. The boy had enrolled in Desert View Middle School 7 weeks ago, and the reports from Betty were cautious but specific. He was quiet, didn't make friends easily, but his grades were climbing. Not dramatically, not the trajectory of a child prodigy, but the steady upward movement of a brain that had been starved of structure and was finally getting fed. His English teacher had sent a note home saying he'd written an essay about mechanical engineering that was remarkably mature for his age. Betty had pinned it to the refrigerator. Charlie had pretended not to notice. In the garage, the transformation was more visible. Big Phil had started giving him real work, not the supervised training wheels tasks of the first weeks, but actual jobs. Oil changes on member bikes, brake pad replacements, carburetor rebuilds on the smaller engines. Charlie's hands had developed the particular kind of confidence that comes from repetition. The assurance of someone who knows exactly how much torque a bolt needs, who can feel the difference between a properly seated gasket and one that's going to blow in 200 miles. He still had nightmares. Betty reported them weekly to Manny in brief clinical descriptions. Frequency, duration, the words Charlie said in his sleep that he never said awake. Dale's name came up a lot. The word please came up more. Manny absorbed this information and stored it the way he stored everything, in the place behind his expression where things accumulated until the weight became structural, part of him, inseparable from the man he'd become. The Tuesday it happened started normal. Betty dropped Charlie at school. Manny was at the compound working on a transmission rebuild with Deacon, who had been unusually quiet for the past week in a way that meant he was thinking about something he hadn't shared yet. Reuben was in his office doing whatever Reuben did in his office, the administrative machinery of keeping a motorcycle brotherhood operational, which involved more paperwork than anyone outside the life would believe. At 10:47 a.m., Manny's phone rang. Betty. They took him. 2 words that rearranged the world. What? CPS. They pulled him out of school. Sandra Whitfield, and a county sheriff's deputy, walked into Desert View Middle School 40 minutes ago and removed Charlie from his 4th period class. The principal called me after. She said they had a court order. Manny's hand tightened on the phone. His 3 remaining fingers went white. In his peripheral vision, Deacon had stopped what he was doing and was watching Manny's face with the tactical attention of someone reading the first indicators of an incoming threat. A court order for what? Emergency removal. Someone filed a petition. Manny, they're saying the guardianship is compromised. They're saying the living situation is endangering. They use that word, endangering. The child's welfare. Betty, who filed it? Danielle. The name landed in the garage like a dropped engine block. Heavy, final, cracking the floor of everything they'd built. Danielle doesn't have the resources to file a court petition. She does if someone's helping her. Who? I don't know yet. My lawyer is on his way to the courthouse. But Manny, they already have him. He's already gone. They put him in a county car and drove him away from school, and he's full. I don't know where he is. They wouldn't tell the principal where they were taking him. Manny closed his eyes. Behind the lids, in the darkness, he saw a 12-year-old boy sitting in the back of a county vehicle watching the school disappear through a window, and the expression on that boy's face would be the one Manny knew by heart. The shutter closing, the door dropping, the survival mechanism engaging, except this time the mechanism was being activated by the people who were supposed to be the alternative to danger. I'm coming to you, Manny said. Hurry! He hung up, looked at Deacon. didn't need to speak. I heard, Deacon said. His voice had gone flat, operational. The voice of a man shifting from peacetime to something else. How bad? They pulled him out of school, court order. Danielle filed something. Deacon's jaw muscles worked. He set down the wrench he'd been holding, slowly, deliberately, the way you set down something when you're resisting the urge to throw it. Get Reuben. Manny walked to the president's office, knocked once, didn't wait for an answer. They took Charlie. Reuben looked up from his desk. The reading glasses he wore when nobody was watching sat halfway down his nose, giving him the incongruous appearance of a college professor, an image that dissolved the instant his expression changed. The transformation was immediate and total. The administrative president vanished, replaced by the man who'd held this club together through raids, arrests, territorial disputes, and the slow attrition of members lost to prison, addiction, and the particular American machinery that grinds down anyone who lives outside the lines. When? Less than an hour ago. CPS. Court order. Danielle's name on the petition. Danielle can't afford a lawyer. Someone's backing her. Reuben took off his glasses, folded them, set them on the desk with a precision that was almost surgical. He stood up, and in the standing, the room shifted. The way rooms always shifted when Reuben decided he was done sitting. Call church. Now. Church was held in the back room. Not a ceremony. Just the word they used for emergency meetings. The moments when decisions had to be made that affected everyone and couldn't wait for consensus to develop organically. The table was a battered rectangle of oak that had been in the clubhouse since the founding, scarred with cigarette burns and ring stains, and the accumulated damage of 30 years of men leaning on it while they argued about things that mattered. 7 men around the table, Reuben at the head, Manny to his right, Deacon across from him, Big Phil, Reaper, and 2 other patched members, Sal, who ran the parts supply, and a quiet gray-haired brother named Virgil who had been with the club since its 2nd year and spoke so rarely that when he did, everyone stopped and listened. Here's what we know, Reuben said. CPS removed Charlie from school this morning under an emergency court order. The petition was filed by Danielle Barnes. Betty's lawyer is at the courthouse trying to get details. Until we know more, everything else is speculation. It's not speculation that someone's funding her, Deacon said. Danielle Barnes doesn't have the money for groceries, let alone a family court attorney. Agreed. We need to find out who. Could be Dale, Big Phil said. Maybe he's got a reason to want the kid back. Dale threw him out, Manny said. What reason would he have to get him back? The question hung in the air. The men looked at each other. And in that exchange of glances, in the particular quality of the silence that followed, something unspoken moved through the room. The possibility they'd all been avoiding, the angle none of them had examined because examining it meant confronting something darker than custody disputes and legal petitions. Manny's phone buzzed. Betty. He answered on speaker. My lawyer got into the filing, Betty said. Her voice was controlled but fraying at the edges, the way steel cable sounds before it snaps. Manny, it's not just a custody petition. Danielle filed a motion alleging that Charlie's guardianship placement constitutes endangerment due to the proximity of, I'm reading this directly, a criminal organization with a documented history of violence, illegal activity, and substance abuse. She's arguing that Betty Mercer's connection to the Devil's Ridge Brotherhood makes the guardianship arrangement inherently unsafe. The room went silent, the kind of silence that has weight, physical, measurable. The silence of 7 men absorbing the fact that their existence, their very identity, was being used as a weapon against a boy they were trying to protect. She can't prove any of that, Deacon said. We haven't had a criminal complaint in... She doesn't have to prove it, Betty's voice cut through. She has to allege it. In family court, allegation shifts the burden. The county has to investigate, and during the investigation, Charlie stays in temporary placement. Where? A group home in San Bernardino, 37 other kids, overworked staff, minimal supervision. The table absorbed this. Manny's 3-fingered hand was pressed flat against the oak, and he could feel every scar in the wood, every groove, every mark left by every man who'd ever sat in this chair and made a decision that felt impossible until it was made. There's more, Betty said. The attorney who filed the petition on Danielle's behalf. His name is Gregory Sloan. He's not a family lawyer. He's a personal injury attorney out of Riverside. Personal injury, Rubin repeated. He works contingency cases, accidents, workers' comp, that kind of thing. But 6 months ago, he started taking family court cases, specifically cases involving children placed in non-traditional guardianship arrangements. Why? Because there's a class action lawsuit being assembled. An advocacy group out of Sacramento is challenging guardianship placements with, and I'm quoting from the brief, organizations designated as potential criminal enterprises. They're arguing that any child placed in proximity to a motorcycle club, regardless of the individual circumstances, is being endangered by definition. The words settled into the room like smoke. Each man processed them at his own speed, through his own filter, arriving at the same conclusion through different routes. This wasn't about Danielle. Danielle was the face. Danielle was the sympathetic mother in recovery trying to reclaim her child from a biker gang. The story wrote itself. The kind of story that played well in courtrooms and on local news and in the minds of judges who had never ridden a motorcycle and couldn't conceive of a world in which the men who did were also the men who kept a 12-year-old boy alive when every other institution failed. They're using him, Manny said. They're using all of us, Rubin said. Charlie is a test case. If they win this, they set precedent. Every guardianship, every informal arrangement, every kid who's ever been protected by a club anywhere in the state becomes vulnerable. So what do we do? Big Phil asked. His voice was rough. His hands were clenched on the table edge, the knuckles scarred and oil-stained, and there was something in his face that Manny recognized, the helplessness of a large, capable man encountering a problem he couldn't solve with strength. Virgil spoke. The room stopped. Harold knew, he said. His voice was dry and careful, each word placed like a stone in a wall. He was looking at the table when he said it, at the burn marks, at the history recorded in damage. He talked to me 2 months before he died, said he'd heard about the Sacramento group, said they were looking for test cases, said Danielle had been contacted. Every head turned. Manny's vision narrowed. The fluorescent light above the table buzzed and flickered, and in the strobing half-second of darkness, the world shifted. Harold knew Danielle was going to do this. Harold knew Danielle was being approached. He didn't know she'd go through with it. He was working on something, a plan, but he died before... What plan? Virgil reached into the inside pocket of his cut. His fingers moved slowly, arthritic, deliberate. The fingers of a man who'd been holding something for 3 years and was only now setting it down. He pulled out an envelope, yellowed, creased, Harold's handwriting on the front, faded but legible. For Rubin. When it's time. Rubin took the envelope. The room watched. Nobody breathed. The fluorescent light buzzed its idiot drone overhead, and outside a crow called, and somewhere on the highway a truck shifted gears, and all of it, every ambient sound, every molecule of air in that room, seemed to pause while the president of the Devil's Ridge Brotherhood opened a letter from a dead man. Rubin read it. His face changed. Not dramatically. Rubin's face never changed dramatically. But the micro-expressions, the tiny shifts in the muscles around his eyes and mouth, told a story that the men around the table could read because they'd spent decades learning the language of his control. He set the letter on the table, pressed both palms flat on either side of it. Harold set up a trust, Rubin said, 3 years ago, before he died. He put the house, his savings, everything, into a trust for Charlie. Betty is named as the trustee. The trust includes a provision for Charlie's education, his medical care, and his housing through age 21. Why didn't he tell us, Manny said, because the trust also includes a stipulation. Rubin paused, looked at the letter again. The trust is contingent on Charlie having no contact with the Devil's Ridge Brotherhood. The sentence detonated in the center of the room. What? Big Phil's voice cracked on the word. Harold wrote that the only way to protect Charlie legally, permanently, beyond challenge, was to separate him from the club entirely. No visits, no garage time, no relationship with any patched member. The trust documentation specifically states that if Charlie maintains any association with the Brotherhood, the trust can be challenged and dissolved. Manny couldn't move. He stared at Reuben and the letter on the table and the words that Harold Barnes, the man who'd built the moral architecture of their world, had written in the months before he died. And the betrayal was so total and so precise that it didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like surgery. Harold hadn't betrayed them. He'd understood, with the clarity of a man who could see his own death approaching, that the thing they loved, the brotherhood, the club, the family they'd forged from damage and loyalty, was also the thing that would destroy his grandson's chance at a normal life. Harold had chosen Charlie over the club, and he'd been right. He was trying to protect him from us, Deacon said. The words came out quiet, stripped of the usual edge, the usual defensive posture. Just fact, raw and simple and devastating. Not from us, Reuben said. From what the world sees when it looks at us. That's the same thing. No, it's not. But in a courtroom, it might as well be. The distinction was as thin as a razor blade and twice as sharp, and every man in the room understood it because they lived it every day. The gap between who they were and who the world decided they were. The distance between the reality of 7 men who'd rebuilt a boy's life and the narrative of a motorcycle gang that had captured a vulnerable child and indoctrinated him into a dangerous subculture. So what happens now? Manny said, and his voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, hollowed out, mechanical. The voice of a man whose operating system was trying to function around a critical error. Now we have a choice, Reuben said. He looked around the table, made eye contact with each of them in turn. We fight this. We hire lawyers, we contest the removal, we go to court and argue that Charlie's place is here, with us, in the life Harold built, and then tried to take him out of. He paused. Or we do what Harold wanted. We let him go. We sign over the guardianship to Betty exclusively, sever all contact with the club, and let the trust do what it was designed to do. Give Charlie a life that doesn't include us. Manny's 3-fingered hand curled into a fist on the table. The missing fingers ached. Phantom pain. The nervous system screaming from nerve endings that no longer existed. The body's way of grieving what it had lost. He thought about the closet, about the boy sitting on the floor with his hands over his ears, about the spark plugs and the transmission rebuilds, and the quiet mornings in the garage when Charlie would ask a question about an engine and Manny would answer, and in those exchanges, technical, precise, emotionally oblique, something was being built that neither of them could name but both of them needed. He's one of us, Manny said. That's exactly the problem, Reuben replied. The meeting broke at 6 p.m. without a decision. Reuben gave them 24 hours. The men filtered out of the back room one by one, each carrying the weight of the choice differently. Big Phil with his head down, Deacon with his jaw locked, Sal rubbing his face with both hands, Reaper standing in the doorway like he'd forgotten how to walk. Manny drove to Betty's house. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and when she saw his face, she knew. Tell me, she said. He told her. All of it. Harold's letter, the trust, the stipulation, the choice. Betty listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat quietly for a long time, her hands wrapped around the cold cup, her eyes focused on something beyond the kitchen, beyond the walls, beyond the desert, looking at the shape of the life Harold had tried to build for his grandson from the other side of death. Harold told me about the trust, she said. What? He told me. 3 weeks before he died. He came to the house and sat in that chair and told me everything. The trust, the stipulation, the reason. He said, Betty, the best thing I ever did was ride with those men. The best thing I can do for Charlie is make sure he doesn't have to. Manny stared at her. The kitchen light was yellow and insufficient, casting shadows that made everything look older and more worn. And Betty's face in that light was the face of a woman who had carried this knowledge for 3 years, while watching the very men she was protecting build a relationship with a boy she knew they'd eventually have to release. You knew, this whole time. I knew. You let us. You watched us. I watched you save his life. I watched Big Phil teach him to rebuild an engine. I watched you sit outside a closet at 3 a.m. because a 12-year-old boy was afraid of the dark. I watched all of it, and I would watch it again because what Harold didn't understand What he couldn't have understood, because he was a man who thought in structures and plans and legal documents, is that some things can't be put in a trust. Some things don't transfer through paperwork. That doesn't change the court order. No, it doesn't. So Charlie's in a group home tonight. Yes. Manny stood up. The chair scraped against the linoleum, loud in the small kitchen. He walked to the window and looked out at the yard Betty maintained with such precision. The trimmed hedge, the raked gravel, the single cactus in a clay pot by the front step. Everything ordered, everything controlled, a small domain of stability in a landscape defined by chaos. Can you get him back? My lawyer thinks we can get the emergency removal reversed within 72 hours. The petition is procedurally weak. Sloan filed it in the wrong jurisdiction and missed a notification deadline. But reversing the removal is temporary. The underlying case, the class action, the allegation of endangerment, that doesn't go away. So even if he comes back to you, they'll keep coming. Unless the club is removed from the equation entirely, unless Harold's stipulation is activated, unless we let him go. Betty didn't answer. She didn't need to. The answer was in the kitchen, and the cold tea, and the 3 years of silence, and the letter that a dead man had written to a brotherhood that was about to learn the cost of love in a world that didn't believe they were capable of it. Manny drove back to the compound. It was past 9. The desert night had closed around the highway like a fist, and his headlights cut through the dark in 2 yellow beams that illuminated nothing but asphalt and scrub, and the occasional pair of animal eyes reflecting from the shoulder. He drove with the window down despite the cold, letting the air hit his face, using the discomfort to stay present because the alternative was to think, and thinking led to the closet and the wrench and the boy's face when his mother walked away and the question that was no longer theoretical. The compound was dark except for the neon sign. He parked. Sat in the truck for a long time. His phone buzzed. A text from Ruben. 24 hours. He walked inside. The clubhouse was empty except for Deacon, who was sitting in the corner booth cleaning a pistol with the focused intensity of a man performing maintenance on himself. You talked to Betty? Deacon asked without looking up. Yeah. She knew about the letter. Yeah. Deacon set down the pistol. The barrel gleamed under the fluorescent light, and his hands, which were steady, always steady, steadier than any hands had a right to be on a man who'd seen what Deacon had seen, rested on the table on either side of the weapon. Harold was the smartest man in this club, Deacon said, and he was right. We're going to get that kid killed, not with bullets, with this. He gestured at the room, the patches, the cut draped over his chair. With who we are. Who we are saved his life. Who we are is about to take it away. Manny sat down across from him. The booth was vinyl, cracked, exhaling a whisper of cold air through the splits. The two men looked at each other across the table, the way they'd looked at each other across 100 tables in 100 different versions of this moment. Two combat veterans navigating a world that kept finding new ways to deploy the skills it had taught them against the people they loved. He's 12, Manny said. I know how old he is. He's in a group home tonight, 37 other kids, overworked staff, minimal supervision. He's in there right now, Deacon. Right now, while we're sitting here talking about strategy and legal documents, that boy is lying on a cot in a room full of strangers wondering why the people who promised to protect him let someone take him away. And if we fight this and lose, they don't put him in a group home. They put him in foster care, permanent placement, different state, maybe, new name, and we never see him again. Deacon paused. If we do what Harold wanted, if we step back, Betty keeps guardianship. The trust kicks in. Charlie gets an education, a stable home, a life. Without us, but a life. Without us isn't a life. It's a transaction. Maybe that's all we can give him. Manny's fist hit the table. Not hard. Not the explosive violence of a man losing control. Just the solid, definitive impact of a man who'd reached the limit of what he could hold without breaking. The coffee cups jumped. The pistol parts rattled. The neon sign in the window flickered once, like even it was startled. Harold was wrong, Manny said. He was the best man I ever knew, and he was wrong. You don't protect someone by erasing the people who love them. You don't keep a kid safe by taking away the only family he chose. Harold knew something we didn't. Harold was scared. He saw what was coming and he panicked and he made a plan based on fear. And now we're sitting here treating that fear like wisdom because the man is dead and we can't argue with him. Deacon didn't respond. He picked up the pistol barrel, ran an oilcloth through it. The motion was smooth, automatic. The kind of muscle memory that outlasts everything else. The body performing its functions while the mind moves through terrain that has no map. Outside, the wind had picked up. Desert wind, dry and cold, carrying sand against the clubhouse walls in small, abrasive waves. The building groaned the way old buildings groan, settling and resisting and settling again. The architecture of survival expressed in sounds that most people would never learn to hear. Manny's phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. Mr. Delgado? The voice was male, professional, controlled. My name is Gregory Sloan. I represent Danielle Barnes. Manny's hand tightened on the phone. Across the table, Deacon went still. I know who you are. Good. Then I'll be direct. My client is prepared to drop the custody petition. All of it. The removal order, the endangerment allegation, the class action participation. Everything goes away. The offer hung in the air. Too clean, too easy. Manny's combat instincts screamed. The same instincts that had kept him alive in Fallujah, that had told him when a road was wrong, when a building was wrong, when the silence was the wrong kind of silence. In exchange for what? $60,000. There it was. The bullet at the center of everything. Not ideology, not maternal instinct, not the Sacramento advocacy group or the legal precedent or the welfare of a child. Money. $60,000, which was the price Danielle Barnes had assigned to her son's life, which was the price Gregory Sloan had calculated the Devil's Ridge Brotherhood would pay to make this go away, which was the sum total of what love was worth in a system that ran on transactions. She's selling her kid, Manny said. She's exercising her parental rights in a manner that... She's selling her kid for $60,000. Silence on the line. The professional veneer of Gregory Sloan's voice developed its first crack. Not guilt, Manny realized, but annoyance. The irritation of a man whose script had been interrupted. Mr. Delgado, I'd encourage you to consider the alternative. If this goes to trial, the cost to your organization, legal fees, public scrutiny, potential criminal investigations triggered by the discovery process, will far exceed the amount we're discussing. This is a practical solution to, I'll call you back. He hung up, set the phone on the table, looked at Deacon. 60,000, he said. Deacon didn't blink. That's not a custody case. That's extortion. Can we prove that? Can they prove endangerment? The two questions sat on the table between them like two loaded weapons pointed at each other, and the answer to both was the same. Maybe, maybe not. And in the space between maybe and maybe not, a 12-year-old boy was sleeping on a cot in a group home 40 miles away, and every hour he spent there was an hour of damage that no amount of money or legal strategy or brotherhood loyalty could undo. Manny stood up. Where are you going? Deacon asked. To see Charlie. It's 10 at night. They won't let you in. I'm not asking. Manny drove 40 minutes through the desert dark. The group home was a converted motel on the outskirts of San Bernardino. A 2-story cinder block rectangle with bars on the ground floor windows and a parking lot lit by a single sodium lamp that turned everything the color of old bruises. He parked across the street and sat in his truck and looked at the building and thought about all the buildings he'd seen that were designed to contain people who had nowhere else to go, and how they all looked the same, like afterthoughts, like the physical manifestation of a society's decision to acknowledge a problem without actually solving it. He couldn't go inside. He knew that. He had no legal standing, no authorization, no right to be within 100 yards of that building in his capacity as a member of the Devil's Ridge Brotherhood. But he could sit in his truck across the street and watch the dark windows and know that behind one of them, a boy who'd walked through the desert to find his grandfather's promise was lying awake, counting seconds the way he used to count seconds between Dale's truck door and the front door. Because counting was the only thing he could do when the world was happening to him instead of with him. Manny's phone buzzed. Ruben. Decision tomorrow, noon, church. Manny looked at the group home, at the dark windows, at the single sodium light making everything ugly and eternal. Tomorrow at noon, 7 men were going to sit at a scarred oak table and decide whether to fight for a boy they loved or let him go because a dead man told them to. And whatever they decided, fight or surrender, hold or release, stay or step back into the shadow where the world wanted them, the boy behind that window was going to pay the price, because that was the architecture of this life. The men who built the walls never got to live inside them. The men who stood guard never got to sleep. And the men who loved a boy enough to sit outside his window in the dark were exactly the men the world would use as evidence that the boy wasn't safe. Manny sat in his truck until 4 a.m. Then he drove back to the compound, walked into the empty clubhouse, poured a cup of coffee that was 12 hours old and tasted like burnt motor oil, and sat at the bar waiting for noon the way a man waits for a verdict he already knows, with the hollow, catastrophic certainty that whatever comes next will require him to become someone he doesn't yet know how to be. Noon came like a sentence. The 7 men sat at the oak table in the back room, and the silence before Reuben spoke was the longest silence Manny had ever endured in that room, longer than the silence after they'd lost a brother in a highway accident in 2011, longer than the silence after the federal raid scare in 2016, longer than any of the silences that had preceded the decisions that defined who they were and what they were willing to lose. Manny hadn't slept. The coffee from 4 a.m. had been replaced by more coffee, and his hands had the fine tremor of a man running on caffeine and adrenaline and the particular fuel that comes from sitting outside a group home in the dark for 6 hours watching windows that never lit up. His eyes were swollen. His 3-fingered hand lay on the table like something that had been left behind. "We're not paying," Reuben said. Every head came up. "We're not running, we're not stepping back, and we're not doing what Harold asked." He paused. Let the words settle into the scarred wood. "Harold was my brother. I loved him like I love every man at this table. But Harold made a plan based on what the world thinks we are, not what we are. And I will not let a dead man's fear decide a living boy's future." Deacon leaned forward. "Rube, if we fight this, we expose the club to—" "I know what we expose. Discovery, financial records, membership rolls. Every traffic stop, every bar fight, every time any of us so much as jaywalked in the last 30 years gets dragged into a courtroom and displayed for a judge who already thinks we're criminals." "I know. And you want to do it anyway." Reuben looked at Deacon. The 2 men, president and security chief, the strategy and the muscle, the mind and the edge, held each other's gaze across the table, and the conversation that happened in that gaze was longer and more complex than anything either of them could have articulated with words. "Charlie walked through the desert," Reuben said. "He sat at our gate for 2 days. He could have gone anywhere. He could have gone to the police. He could have gone to a shelter. He could have found a church, a school, a hospital, any of the institutions that are supposed to catch children when they fall. He didn't. He came to us. Because his grandfather, who knew us better than anyone, told him we were safe." Reuben's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Harold was afraid, and his fear made him plan for a world where we couldn't be enough. But his faith, the faith he put into that boy, the faith that sent Charlie to our gate, that was the real plan. And I'm not going to contradict it. Silence. Then Virgil spoke for the second time in 2 days, which was more than he'd spoken in some entire years. "Vote." It was unanimous. The next 72 hours moved with the controlled velocity of a detonation in slow motion. Betty's lawyer, the former Marine named Nathan Cross, who had a crew cut and an expression that suggested he considered pleasantries a waste of operational time, filed a motion to reverse the emergency removal at 1:47 p.m. that same day. By 3:15, he'd identified 3 procedural violations in Sloan's original petition, including a jurisdictional filing error that would have been embarrassing for a first-year law student and was potentially career-ending for a personal injury attorney moonlighting in family court. By Wednesday morning, the motion to reverse had been granted. Charlie was coming back. Manny drove to the group home to pick him up. Not because he had legal authority, Betty was there with Nathan Cross and the proper paperwork, but because when they walked Charlie out of that building, Manny wanted his face to be the first thing the boy saw that wasn't institutional. He parked in the lot this time. legally, in a marked space. He stood by the truck with his arms crossed and waited, and when the door opened and Charlie walked out into the daylight between Betty and the lawyer, Manny watched the boy's face cycle through a sequence that would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't spent the last 2 months learning to read the micro-expressions of a 12-year-old who'd been trained by trauma to hide everything. Relief, then anger, then the suppression of anger, then the careful, reconstructed blankness that Charlie wore like armor. The boy walked to the truck, stopped in front of Manny. "Hey, kid." "Hey, you okay?" Charlie looked at him, didn't answer. The non-answer was the answer. An entire vocabulary of not okay compressed into silence in the flat, exhausted eyes of a child who'd spent 3 nights in a room with strangers and had not slept for a single minute of any of them. "Get in the truck," Manny said. Charlie got in. Betty followed in her Camry. Nathan Cross drove back to his office to prepare for what he referred to, with the clipped enthusiasm of a man who genuinely enjoyed legal combat, as the next phase. The next phase began on Thursday when Nathan Cross filed a counter-petition alleging extortion. The $60,000 demand recorded on Manny's phone, because Manny, despite his general distrust of technology, had the combat veteran's instinct to document everything that might later become evidence, became the centerpiece of a filing that reframed the entire case. Danielle Barnes was no longer a concerned mother seeking custody. She was an extortion participant, manipulated by an attorney whose interest in her son's welfare was precisely zero, and whose interest in establishing a legal precedent against motorcycle clubs was entirely about the contingency fees such cases would generate. Gregory Sloan's response was swift and predictable. He filed a motion to dismiss the extortion allegation. He issued a statement through his office calling the Devil's Ridge Brotherhood a dangerous organization attempting to silence a mother's legitimate concern for her child. He contacted a local news station in Riverside that ran a 90-second segment featuring a photograph of the compound, taken from a distance, shot at an angle that made the building look menacing, with a voiceover about growing concerns regarding children placed in proximity to outlaw motorcycle culture. The segment aired on a Wednesday evening. By Thursday morning, Manny's phone had 17 missed calls. The first was from Sandra Whitfield, the CPS caseworker, informing him that the county was opening a formal investigation into the Devil's Ridge Brotherhood's facilities and membership as part of an expanded child welfare review. The second was from Betty, whose voice carried the particular tension of a woman who had woken up to find news trucks parked on her street. The third was from Reuben, who said 4 words. "Church. 1 hour. Now." The meeting was different this time. The air in the back room had changed, charged, electric, the atmospheric pressure of men who had made a decision and were now watching the consequences arrive faster than expected. The table was the same, the men were the same, but the stakes had metastasized overnight from a custody dispute into something that threatened the existence of the club itself. "They're coming for the charter," Deacon said. He said it flat, without drama, the way a field medic announces the severity of a wound. The investigation gives them access. Access gives them discovery. Discovery gives them 30 years of records, financial transactions, membership lists, property deeds, everything. "We've survived investigations before," Big Phil said. "Not like this. This one has cameras. This one has a narrative. Biker gang steals child from recovering mother. That's the headline, Phil. That's what plays on the evening news. That's what the judge sees when he opens his laptop in the morning." Reuben held up his hand. The room stopped. "Nathan says the extortion recording changes the landscape. If we can get it admitted, Sloan's credibility collapses. Without Sloan, Danielle has no attorney, no case, and no class action participation. The Sacramento group loses their test case." "If," Manny said. "If." The word sat there. The conditional that contained everything. Hope, risk, the entire fragile architecture of their counterattack balanced on a single evidentiary ruling by a judge they'd never met. "There's another problem," Nathan Cross said. He'd arrived 10 minutes into the meeting, which was unusual. Nathan Cross was the kind of man who arrived early to everything because punctuality was a form of tactical advantage. His late arrival meant something had happened between his office and the compound, and the expression on his face confirmed it. "Sloan filed a motion this morning to exclude the phone recording. His argument is that California is a two-party consent state, and Manny didn't inform Sloan that the call was being recorded. That's correct, Manny said. I didn't. Which means the recording is potentially inadmissible. The room absorbed this the way a body absorbs a blow. The initial impact, the delayed pain, the spreading awareness of damage. Without the recording, Nathan continued, we can't prove extortion. Without extortion, Sloan's petition stands as a legitimate custody challenge. And without a counterargument, the investigation into the club proceeds, and the class action framework remains intact. So we're back to nothing, Big Phil said. Not nothing. We have the procedural violations. We have the reversed removal. We have Betty's clean guardianship record. But those are defensive positions. We need an offensive move. Like what? Nathan looked at Manny. The look was specific, targeted, carrying a question that the lawyer had clearly been considering for some time. Like Danielle. The room shifted. Every man turned toward Nathan with the synchronized attention of predators registering movement. What about Danielle? Manny said. Danielle is the plaintiff. Without Danielle, there is no case. Sloan can't proceed without a client. If Danielle withdraws the petition voluntarily, not because she's paid, not because she's threatened, but because she genuinely decides to drop it, everything falls apart. The investigation loses its trigger, the class action loses its test case, and Charlie stays with Betty. Danielle won't drop it, Deacon said. She needs money. That's what this is about. Maybe. Or maybe what Danielle needs is something money can't provide. Nathan paused, chose his next words with a lawyer's precision. I've been looking into her situation. She entered a recovery program in Victorville 6 months ago. She completed 30 days of inpatient treatment. She's currently in an outpatient program. Sporadic attendance, but she hasn't been dropped. Her last drug test 2 weeks ago was clean. The information settled into the room like sediment, layers of complication adding themselves to an already impossibly complex situation. She's trying, Manny said. The words tasted wrong in his mouth, like acknowledging something he didn't want to acknowledge. She's trying and failing and trying again, which is what recovery looks like. The question is whether Sloan reached her during a failure or during a try. Does it matter? It matters because a woman who's genuinely trying to get clean and was manipulated by an attorney into filing a petition she doesn't fully understand is very different from a woman who's using her child as a revenue source. And right now we're treating Danielle as the enemy, but Danielle might be a victim. Manny pushed back from the table, stood up, walked to the window and looked out at the lot. The bikes, the gravel, the gate where a 12-year-old boy had sat for 2 days, the access road that Danielle's rusted Nissan had come up trailing blue smoke. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, and the face he saw was a face he almost didn't recognize. Older, harder, carrying weight in the jaw and the eyes that hadn't been there 2 months ago. You want me to talk to her, he said without turning around. I want someone to talk to her. Someone she can't dismiss as a lawyer or a bureaucrat. Someone who understands damage because they carry it. She's not going to listen to me. I'm the man who stood between her and her son. You're also the man who sat outside a closet at 3 a.m. You're the man her father trusted. And you might be the only person alive who can look at Danielle Barnes and see the woman Harold's daughter used to be before everything went wrong. Manny turned from the window. He looked at Reuben. Reuben nodded. A single, small inclination of the head that carried the weight of 30 years of trust. Do it, Reuben said. Finding Danielle took 2 days. She wasn't at the Victorville address. She wasn't at the recovery center. She wasn't answering the phone number Betty had on file, which went straight to a voicemail box that was full. Manny drove to the last 3 addresses associated with her name, a motel, a halfway house, an apartment complex, and at each one found the same residue of a life in transit. People who recognized the name but hadn't seen her recently, who shrugged and looked away, who had their own damage to manage and couldn't be expected to track someone else's. He found her on Saturday, a diner off the I-15 20 miles south of Barstow. The kind of place that existed because highways needed places for people to stop, not because anyone would choose to be there. Linoleum floors the color of bad decisions. A counter with stools that spun too easily. Coffee that was burnt and abundant. Danielle was sitting in a booth by the window. She was wearing the same jeans, a different tank top, a flannel shirt that was too big, a man shirt, probably Dale's, kept because it was warm, and warmth was more important than the associations it carried. She was staring out the window at the parking lot, where a semi-truck was idling, its engine sending vibrations through the glass and into the table and into the coffee cup sitting untouched in front of her. Manny slid into the booth across from her. Didn't ask permission, didn't announce himself, just sat down the way you sit down when the conversation ahead is going to be hard, and the only way through it is to start. Danielle looked at him. Her face did three things in rapid succession: recognition, hostility, exhaustion. The exhaustion won. She didn't have the energy for hostility. It was written in her face. The hollowed cheeks, the dark circles, the particular gray undertone of skin that hasn't seen enough sunlight or enough food or enough of anything that sustains a human body. "I'm not dropping it," she said. "Okay?" "I said I'm not. I heard you. I'm not here about the case." She blinked. The hostility tried to reassemble itself but couldn't find the structure to build on. "Then why are you here?" Manny flagged the waitress, ordered 2 coffees, set his 3-fingered hand on the table between them. Not as a statement, not as a play for sympathy, just as a fact, the way he said it everywhere, because it was his hand and it was what remained. "Harold ever tell you how I lost these?" Danielle looked at the hand, looked away, looked back. "He said it was overseas." Fallujah, 2004. An IED hit our vehicle. I was driving, 3 guys in the back. The blast came through the floor on my side. I pulled 2 of them out. The third one, kid named Rivera, 22 years old from Tucson, I couldn't reach. My hand was... It wasn't a hand anymore. But I kept reaching. I kept pulling at the door with what was left of my fingers, and the fire was coming, and Rivera was screaming, and I couldn't... He stopped. Not because the memory was too much. He'd told this story exactly twice in 20 years, and both times he'd gotten to this point and stopped. Because what came after was the part that lived in the closet of his own mind, the part he visited at 3 a.m. when the coffee was cold and the desert was dark. Rivera died. I spent 4 months in a hospital learning to use what was left, and when I got out, I came here, to the club. Because your father, Harold, drove to Walter Reed in a snowstorm, walked into my room, looked at what was left of my hand and said, "You still got 3. That's enough to hold a wrench and ride a bike. Let's go home." Danielle's eyes were wet. She hadn't given permission for them to be wet. The tears were an ambush, arriving without warning, and she wiped them away with the back of her hand, the same gesture she'd used in the compound parking lot, the same reflexive motion of a woman who'd decided a long time ago that crying was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because your father saved my life. Not by pulling me out of a vehicle, by pulling me out of the thing that comes after, the emptiness. The part where you wake up every morning and the first thought is that you should have died in that truck because at least then the noise would stop." "I know what that feels like." "I know you do." The waitress brought coffee. They sat with it. The steam rose between them, and the semi-truck outside revved its engine and pulled away, and the vibrations in the table stopped, and the sudden stillness was louder than the sound had been. "Sloan is using you," Manny said. "Sloan is helping me get my son back. Sloan is using your case to build a class action lawsuit that has nothing to do with Charlie and everything to do with legal fees. You're a line item, Danielle. You're a procedural instrument. When the case is over, whether you win or lose, Sloan moves on to the next one, and you're standing in the same parking lot you've been standing in your whole life, except now your son knows you sold his safety for $60,000. I didn't sell the phone call, the offer. $60,000 to drop the petition. That was Sloan's idea, not yours." It wasn't a question, and Danielle's face confirmed it. The flicker of shame, the involuntary tightening around the eyes, the way her hands wrapped around the coffee cup and squeezed until the tendons in her wrists stood out like cables. "He said it was a settlement offer. He said it was standard." "It was extortion, and it's on a recording. And if it goes to court, it won't be the club that looks bad." Danielle stared at him. The calculation was visible. The desperate math of a woman trying to figure out which version of the truth was least catastrophic. "What do you want?" she said. "I want you to meet your son." The sentence landed wrong. Danielle flinched, actually flinched, her shoulders pulling up, her head drawing back, the full body recoil of someone who'd been expecting a blow and received something worse. "What?" "Not custody, not a negotiation, a conversation. You and Charlie in a neutral location, supervised, no lawyers, no agenda. Just a mother and her son in the same room for the first time in... How long?" "He doesn't want to see me. He told me to... At the compound, he's 12. He's angry. He's hurt. And he's your kid." Manny paused. "You showed up at the compound because Sloan told you to show up. You demanded your son because Sloan told you that demanding was leverage. But under that, under the petition and the lawyer and the $60,000, there's a woman who drove to a biker compound in a car that barely runs to see a boy she lost. And I don't think that woman was acting." Danielle's composure finally broke. Not dramatically. She didn't sob, didn't wail, didn't perform the theatrical grief that the situation might have called for in a worse version of this story. She just lowered her head and pressed her forehead against the edge of the table and breathed, and the breathing was ragged and wet and came from a place so deep that it sounded like it was coming from the earth itself, from somewhere beneath the linoleum and the concrete and the desert sand, from the bedrock of a woman who had failed at the only thing that mattered and was only now, in a diner booth across from a three-fingered biker, allowing herself to feel the full weight of that failure. Manny didn't touch her, didn't comfort her. He sat on his side of the booth and waited. The way he'd waited outside the closet, the way he'd waited outside the group home, the way he'd been waiting his whole life for the moments when the only useful thing a person can do is be present and let the pain move through without trying to fix it. After 3 minutes, Danielle lifted her head. Her face was wrecked. Mascara-streaked, skin-blotched, eyes swollen. She looked like she'd been through something, which she had. She looked like her father's daughter, which she was. "He hates me," she said. "He doesn't hate you. Hating you would be easy. What he feels is harder than hate." "What does he feel?" "He feels everything, and he doesn't know what to do with any of it." Danielle looked out the window. The parking lot was empty now except for her Nissan and Manny's truck, sitting side by side in the pale desert light, two vehicles that had no business being next to each other, and yet were. "If I do this," she said slowly, "if I meet him, and he tells me to leave, what then?" "Then you leave, and you come back, and you leave again, and you come back again, and you keep coming back until he believes you, or until you've proven that you mean it, whichever comes first. That could take years. Your father waited 22 years for this club to become what it is. Patience runs in the family." Danielle almost smiled. Almost. The smile didn't quite make it to her mouth. It got caught somewhere around her eyes, trapped by the weight of everything sitting on top of it. But the attempt was there, visible, real. "When?" she said. "Saturday. Betty's house. I'll be there. Betty will be there. Charlie doesn't know yet." "What if he says no?" "Then we wait, and we try again." Danielle picked up her coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway, the way people drink cold coffee when they need something to do with their hands, and the alternative is letting those hands shake where someone can see them. "Sloan is going to be angry," she said. "Sloan's going to be disbarred. That's Nathan Cross's department, not yours. And the petition? You drop it, voluntarily, on your own terms. Not because we paid you, not because we threatened you, because you decided that your son is worth more than a lawsuit." The sentence hung between them. Danielle turned it over, examined it, held it up to the light of her own damage, and calculated whether she could afford to believe it. "He looks like Harold," she said quietly, "when he was standing in the garage, the way he held the wrench, just like my dad. I know. I ruined everything. You ruined some things, not everything, not yet." Danielle set down the coffee cup. She looked at Manny, really looked, past the beard and the scars and the missing fingers and the leather cut, past the surface of a man the world would call dangerous, into the architecture underneath, where the damage was stored and the discipline was built, and the capacity for patience existed because everything else had been destroyed and patience was what remained. "Saturday," she said. Manny nodded, left a 20 on the table for the 2 coffees, walked out to his truck. The desert afternoon was blinding, white light, no shadows, everything exposed and nowhere to hide. He sat behind the wheel and gripped it with his 3-fingered hand and felt, for the first time in weeks, something he didn't fully trust because every time he'd felt it before, it had been followed by the thing that killed it. Hope. He drove back to the compound, called Reuben from the road. "She'll do it." "When?" "Saturday. Betty's house." "Does Charlie know?" "No." "Who tells him?" Manny watched the highway unravel ahead of him, straight and endless, the dotted center line pulling him forward into a future that was either salvation or catastrophe and wouldn't reveal which until it arrived. "I do," he said. He found Charlie in the garage. 6:15 p.m. The boy was bent over a carburetor, his hands working with the precision that Big Phil had taught him, his face carrying the concentrated stillness of someone who had learned that engines were the one thing in the world that made sense, the one system where cause and effect were predictable, where the right adjustment produced the right result, where damage could be diagnosed and repaired according to principles that didn't change based on who was holding the wrench. Manny pulled a stool next to him, sat down. Didn't speak for 2 full minutes, letting the sounds of the garage fill the space, the clank of tools, the hiss of a compressor somewhere, the distant thrum of a Harley on the highway, the ambient soundtrack of a world built on mechanical certainty. "Your mom wants to see you," Manny said. Charlie's hand stopped. The carburetor sat between them, half assembled, its internal passages exposed like the cross-section of something living. "No." "Charlie?" I said no. "She's dropping the petition. The case, the lawyer, all of it. She's walking away from the whole thing." "Good. She should. She wants to do it right this time." Charlie set down the screwdriver, slowly, with the deliberate control of someone who was choosing, very carefully, not to throw it. He looked at Manny, and his eyes were the desert at midday, flat, bright, hot enough to burn. "Right," he repeated. The word was loaded with 12 years of wrong. She wants to do it right. Like the time she left me with Dale because her boyfriend in Palmdale had a bigger apartment. Like the time she showed up at school on my birthday and made a scene in the parking lot because she was high and wanted money from the secretary. Like the time she... "Charlie, you don't know. You don't know what it's like to have a mother who shows up like weather. Sunny one day, hurricane the next, gone for 6 months, back for a weekend. And every single time, you think maybe this is the time she stays, and every single time she doesn't. And you learn. You learn that hope is the thing that hurts the most because at least when she's gone, you can stop waiting." The words came out fast, hard, unfiltered. The first time Charlie had spoken this many consecutive sentences about his mother, the first time the wall had cracked wide enough for the flood behind it to pour through. His voice didn't break. It sharpened. 12 years old and the kid was cutting with words the way a surgeon cuts. Precise, intentional, drawing blood from the exact location where the damage was deepest. Manny let it land, all of it. He sat on his stool and absorbed the impact and didn't deflect or minimize or offer the kind of reassurance that would have been insulting to a boy this smart and this hurt. "You're right," Manny said. Charlie blinked. The anger, which had been building toward something explosive, stalled. "What?" "You're right. About all of it, every word. She was wrong. She failed you. She left. She came back at the worst times and disappeared at the worst times, and the pattern was real, and it hurt, and you have every right to never want to see her again." Charlie stared at him, confused. He'd been prepared for a counter-argument, for the adult logic that would explain why he should give her another chance, why forgiveness was noble, why mothers deserved infinite second chances because biology conferred some kind of automatic grace. He hadn't been prepared for agreement. "Then why are you asking me to see her?" Manny held up his hand, the 3-fingered hand, the hand that reached for Rivera and couldn't save him. "Because I spent 15 years hating the army for sending me to Fallujah, 15 years blaming everyone. The officers who planned the route, the intelligence that missed the IED, the medics who didn't get there fast enough. And the hate was justified, every bit of it. But it was also killing me. Not fast, slow. The way rust kills an engine. From the inside out, one molecule at a time, until there's nothing left but the shape of the thing that used to work. He paused. Let Charlie hear the silence between the words. Your grandfather was the one who told me that being right and being free aren't the same thing. You can be right about your mother for the rest of your life. You can carry the evidence and the anger and the proof that she failed you, and nobody, not me, not Betty, not anyone in this club, will ever tell you you're wrong. But carrying it is a choice, and seeing her is a choice. And right now, the only thing I'm asking is whether you're willing to make a choice instead of letting the anger make it for you. Charlie looked at the carburetor, the exposed passages, the precision of its design, the way every part existed to serve the whole. His hands rested on the workbench, scarred, grease-stained, the hands of a boy who'd learned in 2 months what some mechanics took years to learn, because he had an engineer's instinct for understanding how things fit together, and a 12-year-old's desperate need for a world that made mechanical sense. If she cries, I'm leaving, he said. Fair. If she makes excuses, I'm leaving. Fair. If she tries to hug me, I'll keep Charlie. I'll think about it. Manny almost smiled. The expression didn't reach his mouth. It stayed somewhere behind his eyes, in the place where he kept the things that mattered too much to display. But it was there, and Charlie saw it because Charlie saw everything. Saturday, Manny said. Saturday, Charlie repeated. The carburetor sat between them, half-finished. Neither of them moved to complete it. Some things needed to stay open for a while. But outside the garage, in the falling desert dark, Manny's phone buzzed with a text from Nathan Cross that changed the temperature of everything. Sloan just filed an emergency injunction. He's arguing parental alienation. Hearing is Monday morning. If we lose, Charlie goes back to county custody, permanently. And Danielle is legally barred from withdrawing the petition without Sloan's consent. Manny read the text twice. 3 times. The words rearranged themselves each time, but the meaning stayed the same. They had 48 hours. Saturday was the meeting, Monday was the hearing. And somewhere between Saturday and Monday, in the space between a mother sitting down with her son and a judge deciding his future, every decision, every sacrifice, every moment of loyalty and patience and 3 a.m. vigilance would either mean something or mean nothing. And Sloan, Gregory Sloan, the personal injury attorney from Riverside who had never met Charlie Barnes and never would, was betting everything on nothing. Because to Sloan, Charlie was a case number, a precedent, a stepping stone in a legal career built on other people's damage. And to 7 men in a desert clubhouse, he was family. The difference between those two things was about to decide everything. Saturday arrived the way verdicts arrive, slowly, then all at once. Betty's house had been cleaned twice. The kitchen table had been wiped down, the chairs arranged, a pot of coffee brewed, and a second one standing by. Betty had set out 2 cups, not her good china, not the formal service she kept for occasions, but the everyday mugs, the ones with chips on the rims and faded patterns, because this was not an occasion. This was a beginning, and beginnings needed to feel survivable. Charlie sat in the living room on the edge of the couch, dressed in the clothes Betty had bought him. Jeans that fit, a flannel shirt, sneakers that were still white because he'd only owned them for 6 weeks. His hair was combed, his hands were clean, and his face carried the particular expression of a person who has agreed to do something against every instinct in his body and is now sitting with the consequences of that agreement, waiting for the door to open and the thing he's afraid of to walk through it. Manny stood by the kitchen window. He'd positioned himself where he could see both the front door and the driveway because positioning was habit, and habit was the scaffolding that held him upright on days when everything else was shaking. Betty was in the kitchen, not because she needed to be in the kitchen, but because the kitchen was where she managed anxiety, checking the coffee, adjusting the sugar bowl, performing the small domestic rituals that created the illusion of control in situations where control was an abstraction. At 10:07 a.m., a car pulled into the driveway. Not the rusted Nissan, a cab, yellow, dented, trailing exhaust in the cold morning air. The rear door opened and Danielle stepped out. And the first thing Manny noticed was that she looked different. Not transformed, but the bones of her damage were still visible. The thinness, the dark circles, the nervous energy that radiated from her like heat from asphalt. But she was wearing clean clothes. Her hair was brushed. She'd put on lipstick that was slightly the wrong shade, the way someone applies lipstick when they haven't done it in a long time and are working from memory rather than practice. She'd taken a cab because she'd sold the Nissan. Manny would learn this later, that she'd sold the car 3 days ago, used part of the money to pay off a debt, and the rest to buy new clothes for today, because she wanted to walk into Betty's house looking like someone who was trying, and the Nissan was the last piece of the life she was trying to leave behind. Manny opened the front door before she knocked. They looked at each other, the three-fingered biker and Harold Barnes' daughter. And the conversation that happened in that look was brief and complete. "I'm terrified, I know. Go in." Danielle walked into the house. Betty met her in the hallway. The two women hadn't been in the same room in 4 years, and the last time they'd been in the same room, Danielle had been high and screaming, and Betty had been calling the police. That memory occupied the hallway between them like a third person, visible and unignorable. "Betty," Danielle said, "sit down. There's coffee." That was all. No warmth, no hostility. The neutral territory of a woman who had loved Harold enough to extend tolerance to his daughter and had been burned enough times to keep that tolerance on a short leash. Danielle sat at the kitchen table. Her hands were folded in her lap, the fingers interlaced so tightly the knuckles were bloodless. She looked at the hallway that led to the living room, where Charlie was sitting on the couch, and the distance between the kitchen and the living room, 22 feet of hardwood floor, might as well have been 22 miles. "Charlie," Manny said from the doorway. The boy didn't move for a count of 5. Then he stood up, walked down the hallway. Each step measured, deliberate, the pace of someone approaching something that could either heal or destroy him, and not knowing which until he arrived. He appeared in the kitchen doorway and stopped. Mother and son looked at each other. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the opposite of empty. Overfull, packed with 12 years of missed birthdays and broken promises and 3 a.m., phone calls that never came, and the sound of a truck door slamming, and the counting of seconds, and the specific cumulative weight of a mother who was there and then wasn't, and then was, and then wasn't, until the pattern became the relationship, and the relationship became the wound. Danielle's lip trembled. She caught it, pressed her mouth into a line, remembered what Manny had told her in the diner, or maybe just understood, with the instinct of a mother who had failed but had not stopped being a mother, that the worst thing she could do right now was perform her pain in front of a boy who'd been drowning in it for years. "Hi, Charlie," she said. Her voice was steady, barely. The effort it took to keep it steady was visible in her shoulders, in the tendons of her neck, in the way her interlaced fingers tightened until the bones shifted under the skin. "Hi," Charlie said. He sat down across from her. The table between them was small, 3 feet, maybe less, and the coffee cups sat in the center like props in a scene neither of them had rehearsed. Betty poured coffee, set a cup in front of Danielle, one in front of Charlie. Milk, no sugar, the way he'd started drinking it in the garage because Manny drank it that way, and imitation was the first language of belonging. Then Betty stepped back to the counter and leaned against it with her arms crossed, present but not participating, a witness rather than a mediator. Manny remained in the doorway, close enough to intervene, far enough to not interfere. "You look," Danielle started. "Don't," Charlie said. She stopped, swallowed, recalibrated. "Okay. Don't tell me I look like Grandpa. Don't tell me I've grown. Don't do the things you do where you say nice things and then leave. Okay? Say something real or don't say anything." Danielle looked at her son, this 12-year-old boy who spoke with the precision of someone 3 times his age, who had learned to demand honesty because he'd been fed so many lies that he'd developed an allergy to anything that resembled one. And something in her face shifted. Not collapsed. Shifted. The performing stopped. The lipstick and clean clothes version of herself stepped aside, and what remained was rawer and less presentable and infinitely more real. "I was using when you were born," she said. "Not heavily, but I was using, and I told myself I'd stop, and I did stop for a while, and then I didn't stop. And every time I started again, I told myself it was temporary. It was just this once. I'd be clean by Monday, by next month, by his birthday. And the Mondays kept coming, and the months kept passing, and your birthdays kept happening, and I was never clean for any of them. Charlie's hands were flat on the table. His fingers didn't move. His face didn't change. He was listening the way a bomb technician listens, with total attention, tracking every word for the one that might detonate. Dale wasn't the worst one, Danielle continued. There were worse before Dale. Men I brought into our lives because they had apartments or cars or things I needed. And I told myself you were fine. I told myself kids are resilient, kids adapt, kids don't notice. But you noticed everything. You always noticed everything. I did. And I wasn't there. When Dad died, I wasn't there. I was in Palmdale with, it doesn't matter who. I got the call and I didn't come home for 3 days. 3 days, Charlie. Your grandfather died and I didn't come home for 3 days because I was too high to drive and too ashamed to call anyone for a ride. The kitchen was very quiet. The coffee maker ticked as it cooled. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a bird sang 2 notes and stopped, as if it had started a sentence and thought better of finishing it. I know why you came to the club, Danielle said, and I know why you stayed. And I know that those men, Manny and the others, they've done for you what I should have done, what I couldn't do. And hating that is the easiest thing in the world, and I did hate it, and Sloan made it easy to turn that hate into a legal document. She paused. But that's not why I'm here. Why are you here? Because I owe you the truth. Not an apology. I know apologies don't mean anything for me anymore. The truth, which is that I failed you completely. Not because I didn't love you, because loving you wasn't enough to make me stop. And that's the thing I can't fix. I can't go back and be clean for your birthdays. I can't go back and not bring Dale home. I can't go back and be there when Dad died. All I can do is be here now and tell you that I know what I did, and I'm not going to pretend it was anything other than what it was. Charlie stared at her. The bomb technician's attention hadn't wavered, and the detonation he'd been tracking hadn't come, because Danielle hadn't lied. She hadn't minimized. She hadn't offered the escape hatch of intention or the cushion of extenuating circumstances. She'd laid the damage on the table between them like a mechanic laying out broken parts, and the inventory was accurate. And accuracy, from a woman who'd spent 12 years manufacturing excuses, was the most surprising thing she could have offered. Are you clean now? Charlie said. 47 days. That's not very long. No, it's not. What happens on day 48? I don't know. I don't know what happens on day 48. I know what I'm going to try to make happen, but I've been trying before and it didn't work, so telling you it'll be different this time would be a lie. And you told me not to lie. Charlie picked up his coffee, drank, set it down. The motion was mechanical, the same efficient, purposeful movement he applied to everything. The engineering mindset that processed the world in terms of inputs and outputs and the measurable distance between what was promised and what was delivered. I'm not coming back with you, he said. I know. I'm staying with Betty. I know. And I can't. His voice hitched. The first crack. The composure that had held through 2 days at the gate, through the group home, through the closet and the nightmares and the carburetor conversations, developed a fracture that ran from his throat to his eyes. I can't do the thing where you come back and I let you in and then you disappear. I can't do it again. I'll break. I know. So if you're going to do this, if you're going to be here, you have to actually be here. Not sometimes. Not when it's convenient. Not when you're clean and feeling good about yourself. You have to be here on the bad days, too. Especially the bad days. Danielle nodded. Tears were running down her face now. Not the performative tears of the compound parking lot, not the desperate tears of the diner booth, but the quiet, unstoppable kind that come when the body finally releases something it's been holding so long it's become structural. They ran down her cheeks and off her jaw and hit the table, and she didn't wipe them away. I'll be here, she said. Prove it. 2 words. 12 years old. The entirety of a child's demand compressed into a challenge that was also a door. Closed, locked, but not sealed. Not yet. Not permanently. The hinges were still there, the frame was still standing, and for the first time the key was being offered to the person who had always thrown it away. Betty stepped forward, set a box of tissues on the table, stepped back. The gesture was small, practical, and contained more compassion than anything she could have said, because Betty Mercer expressed love through logistics, through clean sheets and properly filed tax returns and tissues placed within reach at the precise moment they were needed. The conversation lasted another 40 minutes. It didn't build to a climax. It wound down. The way storms wind down, not with a final thunderclap, but with the gradual cessation of rain, the clouds thinning, the light changing from gray to silver to something that might, in time, become gold. Charlie asked questions. Danielle answered. Some answers were adequate. Some weren't. Some produced silence that lasted a full minute or more, during which the two of them sat with the inadequacy and didn't try to fill it. When Danielle stood to leave, she didn't try to hug him. She stood on her side of the table and looked at her son and said, "Same time next week?" Charlie looked at Manny. Manny looked back, didn't nod, didn't signal, left the decision exactly where it belonged. "Same time next week," Charlie said. Danielle walked out. Manny followed her to the porch. The cab she'd called was pulling up, and she stood on Betty's front step with her arms wrapped around herself, shivering in the morning cold despite the sun, and looked at Manny with the exhausted, emptied expression of a person who has just done the hardest thing they've ever done and doesn't yet know whether it worked. "He said next week," she whispered. "He said next week." Is that good?" "That's everything." She got in the cab. It pulled away. Manny stood on the porch and watched it go, and the feeling in his chest was not hope. He'd learned to be suspicious of hope, but something adjacent to it, something with a lower center of gravity, harder to knock over. Belief, maybe, or just the stubborn, muscular refusal to accept that things couldn't get better, which was not the same as believing they would, but was close enough to work with. Monday morning. Courtroom 4B, San Bernardino County, Superior Court. Judge Margaret Chen presiding. Nathan Cross arrived at 7:45 a.m. in a suit that fit like it had been built for combat, because for Nathan Cross, a courtroom was a theater of operations, and preparation was the difference between victory and casualty. He carried a briefcase that contained the motion to dismiss Sloan's injunction, the procedural violation filings, a transcript of the extortion phone call, not the recording itself, which was inadmissible, but a sworn declaration from Manny Delgado describing the conversation in detail, which was, and Betty Mercer's complete guardianship documentation, updated and notarized. Manny sat in the gallery in a clean shirt, his leather cut left at the compound because Nathan had told him without apology that optics mattered and the cut would give the judge a story before the lawyers could. Ruben sat next to him. Nobody else from the club was present. Nathan's instruction, same reason. The mathematics of perception requiring a smaller footprint. Gregory Sloan sat at the plaintiff's table. He was younger than Manny had expected, mid-40s, clean-shaven, wearing a suit that was slightly too expensive for a personal injury attorney from Riverside, which told its own story about ambition and the funding behind it. Danielle was not present. Her chair was empty. Sloan had not been informed that she would not be attending because Nathan Cross believed in strategic surprise, and the empty chair was the most eloquent argument he could make. Betty sat in the front row of the gallery, her purse in her lap, her glasses on, her face composed with the determined calm of a woman who had spent 3 years carrying Harold's secret and was now watching the final consequence of that burden unfold in a room with fluorescent lights and a judge in a black robe. Charlie was at school. Betty had insisted. Whatever happened in this courtroom, the boy would be in his 4th period English class, learning sentence structure and pretending to be normal, because normal was the thing Betty was fighting for, and she would not compromise it for the spectacle of a legal proceeding. Judge Chen called the case. Sloan stood. He was smooth. Manny would give him that. The argument was polished, the language precise, the narrative constructed with the skill of someone who understood that courts respond to stories before they respond to statutes. The story Sloan told was simple. A mother in recovery seeking custody of her child, thwarted by a motorcycle organization that had co-opted the guardianship process to maintain control over a vulnerable minor. Parental alienation, institutional capture, a child being raised by dangerous men instead of the mother who loved him. Nathan Cross listened. His face showed nothing. When it was his turn, he stood and placed 3 documents on the judge's bench. The first was Danielle's voluntary withdrawal of the custody petition, signed 2 days ago, witnessed by a notary in Victorville, delivered to Nathan's office by cab because Danielle no longer had a car. The second was the transcript of Sloane's $60,000 demand, accompanied by Manny's sworn declaration. The third was a letter from the Sacramento Advocacy Group's lead attorney, obtained by Nathan through channels that Manny didn't ask about, acknowledging that Danielle Barnes's case had been solicited as a test vehicle for the class action framework, and that Sloane's representation had been funded by the group, not by Danielle. Nathan Cross presented these documents without drama. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture. He simply laid the facts on the bench and let them speak in the language judges understand best. Evidence, procedure, the cold geometry of what can be proven. Sloane objected. Judge Chen overruled. Sloane objected again. Judge Chen looked at him over her glasses with the expression of a jurist who had been on the bench for 22 years and could identify a bad faith argument the way a mechanic identifies a blown gasket, by the sound it makes under pressure. "Mr. Sloane," she said, "your client has voluntarily withdrawn the petition that forms the basis of your injunction. The withdrawal is properly executed and notarized. Without a client and without a petition, your motion is moot." She paused. Additionally, the financial arrangement described in Mr. Delgado's declaration raises concerns that I intend to refer to the State Bar for review. You may wish to consult your own counsel. Sloane's face went through a sequence that Manny recognized from poker. The flash of anger, the suppression, the rapid calculation of remaining options, the dawning realization that there were none. "Your Honor, the motion for emergency injunction is denied. The custody petition is dismissed with prejudice. The guardianship of Betty Mercer remains in full effect." Judge Chen closed the file. "We're adjourned." The gavel came down. The sound was small, a wooden hammer on a wooden block in a room with bad acoustics, but it carried the weight of everything that had led to it. 2 days at a gate, 9 days in a clubhouse, a dead man's letter, a mother's tears, a 12-year-old boy who walked through the desert because his grandfather told him there were men who protect good people. Outside the courthouse, the November sun was thin and sharp. Manny stood on the steps and breathed, really breathed, the full expansion of lungs that had been operating at partial capacity for weeks. And the air tasted like concrete and car exhaust, and the particular chemical signature of a Southern California morning in late fall. Reuben stood beside him. Neither of them spoke for a long time. "Harold was wrong," Manny finally said. "Harold was scared," Reuben replied. "Scared and right and wrong all at the same time. That's what love does. It gives you perfect vision and terrible judgment." Manny almost laughed. The sound didn't quite make it. It got caught somewhere in his chest, tangled in the exhaustion and the relief and the residual tremor of a body coming down from weeks of sustained crisis. But the attempt was there, and Reuben heard it, and the corner of his mouth moved a fraction of an inch, which for Reuben was practically a standing ovation. "Buy you a coffee?" Reuben said. You've never bought me a coffee in 30 years. Special occasion. They drove to a diner. Not the one where Manny had met Danielle, a different one, closer to the compound. The kind of place that had vinyl booths and a waitress who called everyone hon, and coffee that was adequate without being memorable. They sat across from each other and ordered and didn't talk about the case or the court or the letter or the trust. They talked about engines, about a transmission rebuild that Big Phil had been struggling with, about whether the Softail in Bay 3 needed new shocks or just a bushing replacement. They talked about the things they knew how to talk about, which were the things made of metal and oil and measurable tolerances, and in those conversations, technical, specific, grounded in the physical world, was everything they couldn't say about the other stuff, the stuff made of flesh and memory and the unmeasurable distance between who they'd been and who they'd become. 3 years passed, not in a montage, not in a summary. In the slow, accretive way that time actually passes, one Tuesday at a time, one oil change at a time, one nightmare at a time, decreasing in frequency, the therapist Betty had found said, which was the clinical way of saying that the boy was learning to sleep without fear, which was the practical way of saying that the architecture of his damage was being rebuilt, one room at a time, by people who showed up every day and stayed. Charlie turned 15 on a Thursday in March. The desert was doing its spring thing, wildflowers erupting from the scrub in improbable colors, the kind of beauty that only happens in landscapes that spend most of the year pretending to be dead. Betty's yard had a single cactus in bloom, red flowers the color of something you'd see in a dream and wouldn't believe when you woke up. The party was at the compound. Not a party, exactly. The Devil's Ridge Brotherhood didn't do parties in the streamers and cake sense. They did gatherings, men standing around with beers and coffee, music on the jukebox, the garage bays open to the spring air, engines in various states of assembly catching the late afternoon light. Charlie stood in the middle of it wearing a grease-stained t-shirt because he'd been working on a Sportster carburetor when people started arriving and hadn't bothered to change. Because changing would have meant admitting this was an event, and admitting it was an event would have meant acknowledging the feelings that came with it. And he was still, at 15, a boy who managed feelings by converting them into mechanical tasks. But he was taller now, broader in the shoulders. His hands were a mechanic's hands, scarred, calloused, the nails permanently dark with carbon. No amount of scrubbing could remove. His face had lost the baby fat and found the angles underneath, and in those angles, if you knew where to look, you could see Harold Barnes, but the set of the jaw, the steadiness of the eyes, the particular way the head tilted when he was listening to something he hadn't decided about yet. Big Phil had given him the nickname 3 months ago. Not formally. Nicknames in the Brotherhood weren't assigned, they were recognized, surfacing through use until they became fact. Someone had called him Spanner because he'd fixed a transmission with a single adjustable wrench when the proper socket set was buried under 2 years of accumulated garage disorder, and the name had stuck the way good names stick, because it was true. Manny stood by the garage bay watching the gathering from the periphery, which was where he always stood at social events because the center of things required a kind of ease he'd never developed. His coffee was in his 3-fingered hand. His back was against the doorframe. The spring air was warm on his face, and the sounds of the compound, men talking, the jukebox playing something by Johnny Cash, the distant thrum of highway traffic, wove together into the ambient soundtrack of a world that had, against all probability, held together. Danielle arrived at 4. She'd been coming every Saturday for 3 years. Not every Saturday without exception, because recovery wasn't a straight line and there had been weeks when she'd called Betty and said she couldn't make it, her voice carrying the particular flatness that meant she was close to the edge and knew it, and was choosing to stay home rather than bring the edge into her son's living room. Those weeks were hard. Those weeks were the proof that recovery was not a destination but a practice. A daily negotiation between the person she was trying to become and the person she'd been, conducted without guarantee and without end. But she was here today. Clean for 3 years minus the weeks she wasn't, which she counted honestly and without rounding up because Charlie had taught her, in his quiet, relentless way, that accuracy was the only currency he accepted. She was healthier, not transformed, not the glowing after photo from a recovery brochure, but present in her body in a way she hadn't been before, occupying her own skin with the tentative authority of someone who was still getting used to the idea that she deserved to be inside it. She carried a small box. Charlie saw her and walked over. The distance between them had changed over 3 years. Not the physical distance, which was always the same 20 or 30 feet of compound gravel, but the emotional distance, which had contracted slowly, agonizingly, the way a fracture heals. Not smoothly, not without setbacks. There had been arguments, real arguments, the kind where Charlie's voice went cold and Danielle's went high, and the words they threw at each other were sharp enough to draw blood. There had been silences, weeks-long stretches where Charlie refused to talk, and Danielle had to sit across from him at Betty's kitchen table and absorb his anger without defending herself, because defending herself meant making excuses, and excuses were the first step back to the person she was trying not to be. But there had also been moments, small ones. A laugh at something on TV during one of the Saturday visits. The first laugh, startling both of them, breaking the surface of the pain like a fish breaking water, visible for a second and then gone, but proof that something was alive down there. A phone call on a Wednesday night when Charlie had called to ask about a math problem, and the conversation had drifted, the way conversations drift when the people having them are starting to forget they're supposed to be guarded, and they'd talked for 20 minutes about nothing and everything, and hung up without saying goodbye, because saying goodbye felt like too much and not enough at the same time. "Happy birthday," Danielle said. "Thanks." She held out the box. Charlie took it, opened it. Inside, resting on cotton that had yellowed with age, was a pocket watch. Gold-plated, scratched, the crystal clouded, the chain tarnished. On the back, an engraving so worn it was almost invisible. HB, keep time. Harold's watch. Charlie held it in his palm. The weight of it, physical and otherwise, settled into his hand, and his face did something Manny had never seen it do before. It opened, not dramatically, not the theatrical emotional release of a movie moment, but the slow, almost geological opening of a face that had been closed for so long that the muscles had forgotten how to form the expressions it was now attempting. The eyes filled, the jaw softened. The wall, the famous wall, the survival mechanism, the shutter that had dropped 1,000 times to protect the boy behind it, developed not a crack but a window, small, tentative, letting light through for the first time. "Where did you find this?" he said. "It was in his nightstand, the day he died. The paramedics let me take a few things before. I kept it. I kept it the whole time, through everything. I pawned my rings, I sold the furniture, I lost the apartment and the car and every other thing I ever had. But I kept this." Charlie looked at the watch, at his mother, at the watch again. "Why?" "Because it was his, and you're his, and some things you don't let go of, even when you've let go of everything else." Charlie closed his fingers around the watch, held it against his chest, didn't speak. The moment was not forgiveness. Forgiveness was too large a word for something this early, this fragile, this dependent on the accumulation of days and Saturdays and phone calls and the slow, patient work of two people learning to be in each other's lives without destroying each other. It was something smaller, more preliminary, like the first thread of a bridge being strung across a canyon, too thin to bear weight, too fragile to trust, but there, visible, a beginning. Reuben walked out of the clubhouse carrying something. The compound went quiet. Men turned. The jukebox played on, unaware of social cues, but the conversations died, and the beers paused halfway to mouths, and the attention of the entire Devil's Ridge Brotherhood focused on their president crossing the gravel lot with a leather cut draped over his arm. It was smaller than the standard cuts, cut down, resized, the leather lighter and newer than the worn hides the patched members wore. On the back, the Devil's Ridge patch, hand-stitched, the same design Harold Barnes had helped create 30 years ago. On the front, above the left pocket, a name tab in white thread on black leather. Spanner. Reuben stopped in front of Charlie, held out the cut. The spring air moved between them, carrying the smell of engine oil and wildflowers and the particular desert warmth that arrives in the late afternoon and makes everything it touches look like it belongs exactly where it is. "This doesn't make you a member," Reuben said. "You're 15. Membership is a man's choice, and you're not a man yet. But this makes you family, and in this club, that comes first." Charlie took the cut. Held it the way he'd held the pocket watch, with both hands, with the reverence of someone receiving something that represents more than its physical form, something that carries the weight of every night at the gate, and every morning in the garage, and every 3 a.m. closet session, and every Saturday conversation, and every single moment that had led, through damage and loyalty and the stubborn refusal of imperfect people to give up on each other, to this. He put it on. It fit. The compound erupted. Not in cheers, because these were not men who cheered, but in the low, rumbling approval of engines idling in agreement. Hands on shoulders, nods. The briefest of embraces from Big Phil, who was crying and pretending not to. His enormous frame shaking with the effort of containing an emotion his body had clearly never been designed to process. Manny stood by the garage bay. He didn't approach. Didn't need to. Charlie looked at him across the lot. 15 years old, wearing a leather cut with his road name on it, holding his grandfather's watch in one hand and his new life in the other. And the look they exchanged was the look of two people who had sat on opposite sides of a closet door in the dark and found, in that shared silence, the thing that neither of them could have built alone. Family. Not the kind you're born into. The kind you survive into. The kind that's built by the people who show up at 3 a.m. and don't leave. The kind that sits outside group homes in the dark and drives through the desert at 4 in the morning and teaches you to gap spark plugs because spark plugs are simple and the world is not, and everyone needs at least one thing they can fix. The afternoon tilted toward evening. The sky over Devil's Ridge shifted from blue to gold to the deep bruised purple that the desert produces in the minutes before dark, when the light comes from everywhere and nowhere and the landscape looks like it's holding its breath. The neon Budweiser sign flickered on, painting the gravel in red. The jukebox found Merle Haggard, and the music drifted out through the open door and across the lot and into the desert, where it dissolved into the vast, indifferent silence that surrounded everything they'd built and everything they were. Manny poured himself a coffee, sat on the bench outside the garage, watched the compound settle into its evening rhythm, men drifting toward the clubhouse, the clink of bottles, the murmur of conversation, the particular sound a motorcycle brotherhood makes when it's at rest, which is never quite silence but something close to it, something earned. Charlie walked over, sat next to him. The leather cut creaked. New leather, stiff, not yet broken in. It would take months, maybe years, for the leather to soften and conform to his body, to develop the creases and wear patterns that would make it uniquely his. But it was on his back, and it would stay there. They sat together in the fading light, Manny with his coffee and his 3-fingered hand and his 20 years of damage held in careful equilibrium. Charlie with his grandfather's watch and his mother's tentative return and his road name stitched in white thread above his heart. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The engines were quiet. The desert was dark. And somewhere in the silence between two people who had found each other at a chain-link gate on the coldest night of the year, the sound of something healing was so faint you could almost miss it. But it was there, steady as a heartbeat, patient as a boy who waits.